A huge complex of office buildings belongs to one man. In a short time, he was able to build up the capital to $100 million. His name is Tycoon. He once started his business from scratch, and today they organized a conference in his honor, and the man poses in front of the lenses. A man in a luxurious suit looked at the crowd of thousands with pleasure. A microphone made of gold was personally made for him. A reporter from a TV station asked President Pei to share his success story. The cameraman filmed everything with a video camera. Tycoon dazzlingly smiled back. Walking up to the microphone, he thought for a while and said that he was actually just lucky. The young man explained to the enthusiastic crowd that he had no intention of building a financial empire. He had $50,000 to spend. In the year 2009, Tycoon was studying at Handong University of Jingzhou. It was a summer day, and he was sleeping peacefully. Someone called out to him loudly, and the young man started to open his eyes. In a half-asleep state, Chen saw a student leaning over him. Through his sleep, the young man realized that it was Ma Yan. The boy frightenedly exclaimed that today was the vice-chancellor's class, and they had to be on time. Tycoon finally opened his azure-colored eyes and grudgingly asked what classes Ma Yan was even talking about. Ma Yan smiled happily. He leaned closer and noted that he had finally managed to wake up Tycoon. Chen himself was not thrilled. Meanwhile, Ma Yan had already rushed out of their room and shouted on the run that they should go faster. If the provost saw Chen here, there would be trouble. Tycoon sat up on the bed. The 19-year-old student had a terrible headache, and he couldn't figure out what was going on. Looking around the room, Chen realized that he was in a dormitory. He suddenly saw a 10-year-old calendar on the door. Tycoon clutched his head in horror. He felt sweaty at the mere thought that time had taken him back 10 years. The young man hoped that it was all a bad dream and pinched his cheek with all his might. Nearly crying out in pain, Tycoon realized that everything was happening in reality. A bright blue light flooded the room, and the young man had to cover his eyes with his hand, shielding himself from it. After getting slightly used to the light source, Tycoon shifted his gaze to the ceiling and saw a holographic image. Tycoon received the Wealth Transformation System notice and anxiously looked at it, not understanding anything. The student cocked his head upward, staring at the lines. The mere appearance of the holographic screen was interesting in itself. Sitting on the bed, Tycoon read the system messages with surprise. Now his own profile appeared on the screen. The system, meanwhile, announced its tie-up with the new owner and notified of the provision of resources to set up the company. After reading the notification, the young man realized that the system appeared immediately after his time jump, and that was normal. In addition, the system provided the young man with money no matter how well he invested. Tycoon grabbed the calculator. It turned out that if he earned 100,000 yuan, he would only receive 1,000 yuan in his account after conversion. But if the venture was unprofitable, Tycoon would get his 50,000 back in his account. The young man immediately began to daydream. Tycoon had already imagined himself on the ocean. With enough money in his account, he could afford it. Meanwhile, the system offered to choose a company name. After thinking about it, Tycoon decided on the name Tengda. Judging from the system messages, the information update was due in 2 weeks. Tycoon thought it would be easy to spend the money. The young man dangled his feet off the bed and smiled. He knew which industries were lucrative, so he decided to stay away from them. After all, he had money to spend. Tycoon mentally gathered the closed-door meeting in his head. There were 5 of his clones sitting at the round table. Tycoon, who was sitting in the center, hit the table with a wooden gavel and announced the opening of the first spending session. He asked who wanted to speak first, and immediately the student with glasses reached out his hand. The head agreed to listen to Tycoon's student. The student was well prepared and reported that not all activities are authorized. The system mentions 200 types of illegal earning and activities. Tycoon, in a white scarf, thoughtfully confirmed that the system was indeed narrowing the circles of legitimate activities, and they could be punished for making the wrong choice. Tycoon said to himself, "At first glance, this world is the same. Only technology is developing faster and copyright protection is stronger." Thinking about copyright protection, Chairman Tycoon suggested that we get into computer game development. He explained that it takes a lot of money to develop games, and any patches and additions to them would require even more. Student Tycoon agreed that they could really go out at a loss quickly. No one would want to buy a bunch of unnecessary codes. Chair Chen suggested just remembering the games that will be popular for the next 10 years and avoiding them at all costs. So, a plan of action was outlined. The chairman proclaimed that the first step on the road to bankruptcy was to create a game. Student Qian exclaimed that the second step would be to spend the money, followed by the transformation of system funds into a personal account. Another Pei Tian voiced the third stage of development. Throwing around the banknotes, he said that absolutely everything should be spent. All 5 clones sitting around the round table shouted in one voice that they were going to start the plan immediately. Pei Tian folded his hands and rested his chin thoughtfully. The idea of becoming a game developer appealed to him. The young man began to remember all the most famous heroes and antagonists of popular computer games, so as not to repeat their success. He smiled and told himself that it was time to become the richest man in the world. Pei Tian imagined throwing money around in a clear field. Pei Tian immediately began to study the matter and searched for information resources. To prevent anyone from disturbing him, he closed the door. Several hours passed. The young man thought that he had never thought about how long it took to develop a game. Time decided to take the easy way out. He bought a developer package and created a linear track with a truck in the game editor. The young man smiled to himself. Everything was going according to plan. If he continued to spend money on creating an unnecessary game, he would be at a disadvantage. The driving simulator alone cost the young man 20,000 yuan, and it was necessary to spend on the exterior and interior of the car. Besides, a suitable background had to be created. Therefore, another 23,000 for the road among the desert sands went into the abyss. There wasn't much money left, and Qian decided to purchase a radio station and a simple level system with the rest of the amount. Looking carefully at his kit, Pei Tian thought that it looked too simple, and no one would buy it in this form. Pei Tian sat at the monitor and thought intensely. Suddenly, a brilliant idea came into his head. To advance to the next level, the player must play the previous level for a minimum of 8 hours. In addition, turns must be included in the track. 2 hours later, the game code was recompiled, and Pei Tian decided it was time to try out the game in practice. Rubbing his hands together, he rolled up his sleeves and plugged in the wireless gamepad. He was curious to see the masterpiece himself. An endless road in the desert appeared on the screen. A simple interface with a view of the cabin from inside was implemented in the car simulator. At first it was interesting, but after a couple of minutes, the young man realized that only the background was changing, and the road and the car remained in place. Pei Tian couldn't stand it for half an hour. He grudgingly frowned and exclaimed that he couldn't believe that he had created this nonsense himself. After introducing the other players in his seat, the young man said it was not a driving simulator, but sheer torture. Pei Tian contemptuously threw the gamepad onto the keyboard and told himself that he would be cursed for this game. He wouldn't be able to capitalize on it. The young man finally relaxed and put his foot on his knee. It was clear to a fool that with such a disgusting game, he would only lose money. It was late evening. The windows in the dormitory of Handong University began to light up one by one. Students' belongings were drying on one of the balconies, and enthusiastic cheers could be heard from behind the closed door. The 4 freshmen were passionately playing an online game. Yasuo gave a startled warning of the Baron's approach. Ma Yan ate right during the game and told Qian that he didn't understand the young man at all because of his systematic skipping of couples. Pei Tian fiercely clacked the keys and asked the young man to eat faster. He was the reason why they were constantly losing team fights. At that moment on the screens, events were developing rapidly. One of their heroes had been killed, and they had to play it safe. Even though the guys had numerical superiority, the ninja-looking opponent still managed to overpower all 3 of them and caused a grudge match. On all 4 screens, the game picture changed to a bright red background with explosion effects, indicating their defeat. Pei Tian's personal record was 11 enemies killed. At the same time, he was only killed twice, and yet the team still lost. Ma Yan calmly continued eating and said that Qian was not playing well. But he himself could only defeat 2 enemies, and he died twice as well. Pei Tian couldn't stand it and wailed that Ma Yan had been saving up personal points on the sidelines the entire game and was now blaming him for losing. Ma Yan was an average student. He wanted to be on top of everything, so he was mediocre at everything. It's the same with games. Having had enough, Ma Yan shouted that he wanted to play again. 2 students supported his proposal. Pei Tian got up from the table and said, yawning as he walked, he was very sleepy. Besides, he had to get up very early tomorrow. The young man was in fact so tired that he fell backwards onto the bed and immediately closed his eyes, hoping to get a decent night's rest. But the intrusive thoughts did not let up, and Pei Tian immediately opened his eyes. He had already seen his 50,000, which he would receive in 2 weeks. It was all in his hands now. With money, he would have what many could only dream of. He would have many girls at his service. Pei Tian will be able to buy any computer and any console. not to mention cell phones and other gadgets. In one of the apartments in Dai City, streamer Chao Liang was at his computer in a shabby, dirty apartment. He was also a moderator on the website. The man was very concerned about the fact that releases of videos dedicated to new games were getting worse and traffic to the site was dropping. Turning on the electric kettle, Chao Liang told himself that he had to accumulate the required number of hits, or he wouldn't be able to pay the bills. Browsing through the games, the man discovered a new car simulator. The road curved beautifully in the desert. The abstract assured that it was a revolutionary game. Chao Liang's glasses slid down his nose in surprise. The very name, Lonely Desolate Road, already said that it was nothing. However, on the website, the manufacturer has clearly stated that this magnificent and revolutionary game costs only $1. In addition, the developer assured that the game will help to reflect on life. Streamer would like to see how it will be possible to do this for $1. The game's depiction of the desert was so hatchet job that it made you involuntarily wrinkle your nose in frustration. In addition, Chaolin couldn't get used to the controls. All the elements were inconveniently scattered among the different buttons, and the music was like it was taken from some horror movie. There wasn't much interest in playing. The only thing that saved the situation was that Chaolin had devoted many years to the video game industry, and it was hard to surprise him. Of particular inconvenience, the only thing was that the man had been spinning the steering wheel of the simulator for quite some time now, but nothing was changing. The man was starting to get angry that nothing was happening, so he decided to give the game another 10 minutes in hopes that things would get more interesting from here on out. Even the extra 10 minutes didn't save the situation. His hands were getting stiff and shaking. The man was sweating a little, and the same road was still on the screen. Chaolin caught himself thinking that he couldn't explain why he was still playing this horrible game. Moreover, the man did not understand the ultimate goal of the game. After all, he is constantly driving along the road and nothing happens. Only occasionally there is a turn. Suddenly an interesting thought occurred to him. After all, everything in this simulator is just like in life, just as bleak and gloomy. Meanwhile, the electric kettle had long since boiled, and the food had already cooled down. Chaolin decided to have a snack and continue later. Streamer pressed the button to stop the game and was surprised to realize that the developer simply did not provide such a function. Chaolin was simply furious. He simply couldn't believe that there was no pause and fiercely pressed several buttons in succession, but nothing helped. At the same moment, his truck on the screen lost control. He crashed at full speed into a rock and went off the road. To the man's surprise, an inscription appeared on the screen, indicating that the game was over. Chaolin couldn't believe that the whole journey had to start from the beginning. For the first time in the entire game, the man smiled. He decided after the meal to make a decent mockery of this game on his channel. 2 weeks had passed. The dormitory of Handong University lived its normal life. Some people were playing outside. Some students were preparing for classes. Pei Qin sadly watched Chaolin's channel live. He was tearing down his creation because he had to sit for 8 hours. Besides, any missed turn in this game was the end of the game, and everything had to start from the beginning. It was the phrase at the end of the game that stuck with the man the most. She mockingly congratulated him on the fact that Lan had spent 8 hours of his life wasted. Streamer thumped the table with all his might. He shouted that this game really helped him think about life and its possibilities. Pei Qian held his head. He couldn't understand how such a horrible craft could get on a computer game channel. The young man immediately began writing a commentary on his game, explaining that he realized how bad his game was. Almost immediately, there was a sprinkling of responses to his comments. Strangely enough, a lot of people liked the game for the price. Pei Qian almost cried out of helplessness. The young man assumed that there was something wrong with himself, and he was gradually going crazy. Anyway, it had been 2 weeks. He made himself comfortable on the chair and called up the system menu. To his dismay, there was no money to be made. All 50,000 yuan were gone, and the system only transferred 155 yuan to his account. The situation was dire. It was urgent to figure out how to make money with the help of these system coefficients. Therefore, Pei Qian gathered another emergency meeting in his head and declared it open. Rattling his gavel on the table, the chairman frowned and said that he hadn't counted on successful sales. Unfortunately, they had managed to sell 20,000 copies of the game. Student Pei Qian quickly calculated that after the system conversion, they would only receive 700 yuan, a paltry amount. The chairman sipped some coffee and said the tears would not help their grief. We have to decide how to spend the next 50,000. One of the doppelgangers suggested asking for outside help. The secretary of the meeting became furious. The idea seemed unacceptable to him. It became clear that nothing could be solved quickly. A heated discussion began, and Pei Qian's clones offered various options. The chairman liked one of the candidates. He smirked and remarked that that person always managed to screw things up. The clones shouted out loud that this was the young man they needed. He's the best at pulling the team down. Suddenly, the door opened, and a joyful Ma Yan poured into the room with a bag of food. It was his candidacy that was being discussed at the sham meeting. Pei Qian smiled and exclaimed that Ma Yan had come on time. He took the package and said that everything was now back to normal. Ma Yan looked at his classmate in surprise. Pei Qian said that the young man was his only hope. Ma Yan scratched the back of his head. He wrote off all this strange behavior as his friend's hunger had just gone crazy. Meanwhile, Pei Qian was already envisioning the finalized version of the car simulator. He was going to modify the dashboard. Also, it would be nice to add a real roadmap to the game. It would add some element of realism. Pei Qian and Ma Yan went to the evening cafe nearby. It was almost empty, with only two small groups of people celebrating something. The kebab shop smelled too appetizingly of fried fish and marinated meat. The boys couldn't resist the temptation. Pei Qian ordered a little bit of everything, and Ma Yan couldn't decide where to start for a long time, and then just ate from two hands at once, praising the delicious food. After eating a bit, the young man decided to ask what the occasion was that Qian had brought him here. He thought his neighbor had won the lottery. Thinking of the 50,000 yuan lost, Pei Qian thoughtfully replied that in a way, that was the case. Ma Yan couldn't get enough, and this time, he finished another stewed wing. Qian was counting his profits. After sipping some cola, the young man almost cried. After all, he had only been able to deposit 900 yuan. After studying the system messages, Pei Qian realized that the next recalculation would take place in 30 days. 300,000 yuan must be spent in that time frame. Ma Yan didn't understand how one could remain indifferent amidst such deliciousness. He perplexedly said that it would be good for Qian to eat as well. Pei Qian thoughtfully replied that he had started to do game development and needed an assistant now. He looked at the person he was talking to expressively. Ma Yan almost choked and exclaimed that it required a lot of money. He asked if the young man had any seed money. Pei Qian said that he would no longer hide the truth. In fact, he is from a rich family and has 300,000 yuan available. Ma Yan turned green with envy. He had never even seen such a large amount of money up close. Pei Qian smiled. He realized that his neighbor easily believed him. Ma Yan puzzledly asked if Pei Qian knew the basics of programming and web design. Qian said that one could just buy a file on the internet. Ma Yan loudly opened his can of Coke and announced that they didn't know anything about computer game development. He stared at his jaw and hesitantly said that it wouldn't be entirely reasonable to waste 300,000 yuan. Pei Qian was filled with anger. He didn't think that his neighbor would be conscientious. Now he had to persuade him too. The young man decided to use the last argument. He coughs meaningfully and asks if he has heard of the Lonely Desert Road. Ma Yan immediately blurted out that the whole country knew about that unfortunate and stupid game that had just recently gained popularity. Pei Qian smiled and proudly told his classmate that he was its developer. Ma Yan couldn't hold back, and all the cola from his stomach instantly ended up on the table. Pei Qian looked at the young man anxiously. After calming down a bit, Ma Yan looked at his interlocutor incredulously and asked if he had really created that idiotic game. Ma Yan suddenly changed his tone and exclaimed that Pei Qian has talent. He is not proficient in all this, but he is willing to cooperate with such a genius. Ma Yan snapped out of his seat and ran to the store to get programming books. Picking up such a win that one girl had to hold up her dress, Pei Qian belatedly wanted to shout that he didn't need the books at all. But his future employee was already gone. Now the young man was faced with a dilemma. Ma Yan was so active that he could really screw up the whole thing and make the project win. It was late evening. The windows in the dormitory of Handan University were lit up. The sky was gloomy and overcast. The door to the boys' room opened, and a happy Ma Yan walked in. He had brought a pile of books and could barely carry them. The pile was as tall as his waist and as high as his eyes. Pei Qian was surprised that there were too many books, and Ma Yan rattled the entire stack on the table. On top was a collection of anecdotes. Justifying himself, the young man showed 4 books of not quite computer-related topics and explained that he took them only because of the discount. Pei Qian angrily thought the programmers were mostly suffering from pressure and stress, not baldness and neck pain. However, he didn't want to scare the young man away and winked at him, telling him that Ma Yan had brought exactly the books he needed. Taking one of the programming books for beginners, Ma Yan admitted that he knew the meaning of each word individually, but it was difficult to understand everything together. Pei-kin chuckled to himself that Ma Yan was dumb as a cork. After all, he had told the young man earlier that books wouldn't help him. Making a serious face, Pei-chen said that they needed design books first, especially since some of these books were already outdated. It was only now that Ma Yan realized his oversight. All these books had been bought at a discount, so he couldn't return them to the store. Pei-kin said that it would be good to flip through them anyway, especially since Ma Yan could file a complaint against the company if he wanted to. Ma Yan grabbed one of the programming books and said it was time to get to work and start studying the books he had bought. After a while, Pei-chen turned around in surprise when he heard snoring. Ma Yan was snoring peacefully with his self-study book over his eyes. Pei-kin jumped up from his chair and happily slapped his palms on the surface of the table. He was in a good mood. Pei-kin was grateful to the judge for such a valuable and diligent employee. This was exactly what he needed. The young man even regretted that Ma Yan was the only one of his kind. If he hired a couple more of them, he would quickly become rich. Unfortunately, these were only dreams for now, and Pei-chen stared at the monitor, thinking about how to drain the money as quickly as possible. He sat down at the table with a smug expression and put his fingers together. Anyway, there were 300,000 yen to spend. Early in the morning, Pei-chen woke up his roommate by slapping the cards on the table. He scrutinized them carefully, unhappily wiping his sleepy eyes with his fists. Ma Yan suggested that they would be creating a mobile card game. Pei-kin said that he has already purchased the card templates, and they will do a mobile app based on the Three Kingdoms game. Sliding down from the top tier of the bed, Ma Yan said that Three Kingdoms is a very successful game, and Pei-chen just wants to make a game in its likeness. The youngster added that there are so many developers now, creating card games for mobile apps. Ma Yan searched his pockets for his cell phone. An interesting thought occurred to him, and he wanted to share it with his friend. He loaded up the game store on his phone and showed me that half of the same type of games are just made in the image of this one. Pei-kyung smirked and said to himself that this was why he had chosen the Three Realms. A game like this would get lost faster. Given the incredible competition among card games, his new craft had absolutely no chance of success. And this time, he's definitely going to make a loss. It was time for another clone meeting at the round table in Pei-kyung's head. The chairman glanced glumly in front of him. He hit the table with a wooden mallet and asked who would start first. Student Qian's hand immediately surged upwards. The chairman smiled. He suggested that the other participants give the student a chance to express his opinion. The student noticed that the Three Kingdoms game has a more complex payment system than other mobile apps. One of the participants at the meeting confirmed his words. He said that with a game costing 5 yuan, in-game purchases could reach 1,000 yuan. The chairman suggested increasing the cost of in-game purchases. Players will start complaining, and their sales will plummet. The student counted that even then, a couple of rich players would be able to afford everything, and their losses would turn into profits. Pei-kin imagined a player in luxurious clothes and an expensive sword. Behind his back, a man in rags and carrying a stick was almost invisible. The chairman exclaimed that they should go in the opposite direction. They would just remove in-game purchases, and there would be nowhere to spend the money. They decided to put the price of the game at 10 yuan. In addition, it was possible to purchase premium player status for 30 yuan. They have already anticipated the reaction of players and their complaints that there is just nowhere to spend money, and the game is about nothing. Pei-kin was telling the surprised Ma Yan, who was standing at his back, the benefits of the patent and the modes of play obtained from it. Only now did Ma Yan remember its cost, and incredulously clarified whether a couple of game modes really cost 100,000 yuan. Pei-chen smiled and said that it was actually pennies. His own development would be even more expensive. In fact, the young man even regretted that the template is so cheap. He would have bought it for 150,000 because you had to spend the money quickly. Pei-chen said that they would now need to work on the battle effects and the appearance of the cards. Ma Yan was surprised to realize that the shopping still wasn't over. After scratching his head, Ma Yan asked the young man how much he was willing to give for the appearance of the game. Shen was concentrating on changing the data in the game editor. Raising 3 fingers, he said thoughtfully, leaving 30,000 for sound effects and 10,000 for everything else. Suddenly, Pei-chen slammed his fist on the table with all his might and declared that the remaining 60,000 would be used for the design. Ma Yan jumped back in surprise. Pei-chen picked up a weighty stack of documentation that fit on 100 sheets and said that the planning was done. He handed the documentation to his employee and offered to make sure. Ma Yan had not expected the development process to be so labor-intensive. Pei-kin smiled and explained to the guy that he was leaving the effects and appearance of the game to himself. while his partner would have to design the game cards themselves. Ma Yan was not at all prepared for this and began to frantically wipe the sweat off his face. He started making excuses that he had only seen that game on TV and didn't know it well. Pei Chen put his hands on his shoulders in a friendly manner and said that he believed in him. It's even better because you need characters to be unconventional, stammering. Ma Yan said that he would try his best. He took the documentation and leaned on the back of the chair to avoid falling. His legs couldn't hold him up at all. Pei Chen smiled and encouraged the young man, wishing him good luck. Of course, he wouldn't really trust Ma Yan if he understood the principles of the game. Ma Yan was already turning green from overexertion. He still didn't know where to start. Pei Chen only chuckled and said that he only needed to sketch the sketches themselves. At one point, Ma Yan looked up and asked if he could make Guan Yu's character in the form of a dragon. The young man replied that it was an excellent idea. Ma Yan could not be expected to be independent, and he kept asking if he could change the appearance of the characters to mythical. Pei Chen agreed with everything. Finally, Ma Yan showed the first finished sketch. It was a girl in revealing clothes with a huge blade twice the width of her face. Pei Chen rejoiced and exclaimed that Ma Yan was simply a genius designer. He enthusiastically raised his 5 fingers upwards. Ma Yan turned out to be the right man and turned the bandits into girls. Now no one will ever look at this horrible game. After analyzing the popularity of different styles, the young man decided to do the opposite and opted for a realistic look for the characters. After looking through several portfolios, Pei Chen decided on an artist named Ruan Guanjian. His prices were affordable, and he painted in a completely different style, so the chance that his work would be good was slim. Pei Chen logged into his personal account on the website and wrote a private message to the artist inviting him to participate in his project. The young man assured the artist of his solvency. Rejoicing at his ingenuity, Chen sent the message. Ma Yan was still absorbed in his work, and Pei Chen proudly thought that he couldn't think of anything worse than offering a job to an aspiring artist, especially since Pei Chen himself didn't introduce any new elements to the game and only increased its cost to 10 yen. At this time, Ma Yan was diligently writing something. Pei Chen didn't notice it. He could already see himself swimming in the money from the loss-making game. The next morning came. It was time for refreshment, so the boys went to the student canteen of Handan University. As usual, there were few people and you could choose any table you wanted. Pei Chen and Ma Yan sat closer to the aisle, opposite the order counter. While Ma Yan was passionately massacring another chicken leg, Pei Chen was scrutinizing his sketches. The list of requirements was quite satisfactory. Of course, it would have been better to leave it blank, but that would do. Carefully flipping through the documentation of the maps that Ma Yan was supposed to make, the young man smiled. He realized that everything was hopeless. He made a satisfied face and assured his partner that he had done an excellent job. In fact, Chen liked the fact that this game was nothing like that hit at all. Ma Yan perked up and exclaimed that he had another idea. Pei Chen smiled and asked to share his thoughts. The young man suggested making all the divine warriors in the game female. He thought it was a delightful idea. Pei Chen immediately stopped smiling. He didn't like this idea at all. After all, this way the game could attract unnecessary attention. Pei Chen stood up from the table and threw the documentation on it. He waved his hands and shouted that this would definitely not be the case. Ma Yan asked in surprise why they couldn't do it. After all, Pei Chen himself had said yesterday that they needed something new. Pei Chen realized that he had overreacted a bit and softened his tone. He tried to explain to his partner that the characters would lose their uniqueness. The young man smiled at Ma Yan and said that the young man had done quite well as it was. Those characters in the form of centaur and dragon are already recognizable as it is. Ma Yan tried to pretend that he understood his comrade's train of thought. He said with a smart look that he now understood what the matter was. Pei Chen gave the documentation to his partner and asked him to transfer it to the computer's memory. And he himself needed to talk to the artist. Pei Chen heaved a sigh of relief. Even though Ma Yan had almost caught him, the young man still managed to trick him. The modern port city of Mo with high-rise buildings and offices was erected on one of the islands. The University of Economics and Finance was located in this city. For the convenience of students, the dormitory of the Faculty of Arts was located nearby. In a room with a small window, a young man sat at a computer desk, while his 2 roommates peered over his back at the monitor. This was the very same artist, Ruan Guanjian. His partners were surprised that he had managed to get an order and inquired about the requirements. Guanjian asked his friends to move farther away. He said that he needed to communicate with the customer, and his livelihood depended on it. The artist sent Pei Qian a private message back and said he was interested in his proposal. A long correspondence ensued, and Pei Qian suggested that the artist meet in a virtual chat room. The interlocutors found themselves in a virtual temple and listened to each other from high podiums. A red carpet lay between them. Guanjian twirled the pen between his fingers with impatience and asked if there were any special requests for the order. Pei Qian replied that he needed 50 characters, but not in the chibi style. 4 drawings are required for each character. Guanjian was dumbfounded because he clearly stated in his portfolio that he creates chibi-style drawings. And that's exactly what the customer doesn't want. After thinking a bit, the artist set the price at 2,000 yuan per character. He admitted that it was a bit expensive, but worth it. Pei Qian was dissatisfied with such a price. After all, in this case, he wouldn't be able to spend all his money. He made an indignant face and shouted a protest. He was not satisfied with the price for the character drawings being too low. Guanjian didn't immediately understand what the customer wanted and tried to object that he couldn't discount the price. It was already too low. Pei Qian revealed that the conditions would not be easy as they needed something out of the ordinary. In addition, the requirements are not quite precise. The young man slammed his palms on the table and stared at the floor for a few seconds, pretending to think intently. He showed the artist 3 fingers and exclaimed that he thought the price of 3,000 yuan was sufficient, considering the extra work. It was the first time the artist had ever seen such a strange customer who would not reduce the price, but add to the cost of the work. Pei Qian smiled and took out the documentation. He said that he had brought a list of requirements and Guanjian could familiarize himself with it. Barely glancing at the first page, the artist realized that it was even worse than he had thought. It couldn't even be called project requirements. Guanjian was indignant and said that he was not even provided with examples. And the requirements themselves are very vague, and he is not responsible for such work. Pei Qian asked him not to worry and promised that he would accept his work in any form and not make him redo it. Guanjian was still doubtful, but he thought that the young man's words were quite convincing and offered to sign the digital contract. Pei Qian smiled and took out a piece of paper. The pen was already at the ready. The young man was only waiting for this moment. Pei Qian sprawled his signature in the middle of the white sheet and showed it to the artist with a smile. After leaving the chat room, Pei Qian figured out what still needed to be spent on. Ma Yan snored quietly, having considered his work done. Guanjian immediately called out to his neighbors Huang and Zhou. He asked them to come over to him quickly. There was work for everyone. Everyone amicably recognized that this is simply an excellent price, and for such a fee, one can draw chibi, even through effort. One of the guys called him crazy when he found out that the client didn't want chibi this time. After all, the portfolio included chibi-style drawings. The enraged artist asked everyone to step back and stay out of his way. He shouted and explained that he had a smart customer. She actually hated drawing in the chibi style, but he needed a job at the time, and the artist agreed. But now he doesn't have to do that. For the first time in his life, Guanjian had a chance to show the world what he was worth. Considering that the chibi style could not be used, Guanjian tried the other techniques and chose the most suitable one. The artist depicted a large hero with a 2-handed hammer, using an ink style with an oil paint effect. His roommates watched his sketches from the back. One of them asked if it met the customer's requirements. Guanjian sighed heavily and moved away from the computer desk on the chair, pushing away with both hands. He told his friends that he had to convey a sense of epicness, and here the character's appearance plays a very strong role. The artist stated that it wouldn't have fit before, but the characters were changed and so the style harmonized with the game. The other guy said, puzzled, that they didn't know how to draw like that. Neither of them had drawn in this style before. Gene smiled and said that he would do the character designs himself, and his friends would only tweak everything. That way, they would get everything done. The artist said that they had nothing to lose anyway. And if the case goes well, they can even organize their own studio. 4 young men decided to make their order in the best possible way. Perhaps their future careers depended on it. The future artists were eager to get to work. They worked hard for 3 weeks, and one evening they put the finishing touches on their work. Finally, Guanjian carelessly tossed his pencil onto the graphics tablet and reported that they had finished their big job. Despite the black eyes from lack of sleep, the artist looked happy. He was just about to invite his friends over for dinner. To his surprise, he realized that the boys had no time for dinner. As soon as they heard the end of their work, all 3 of them had fallen asleep where they were working. Guanjian scratched his head puzzledly and promised himself that he would feed his partners a good lunch in that case. The artist was also very tired. Walking over to the computer desk, the young man yawned several times. But before resting, he had to finish his work. Guanjian went to the artist's forum and sent a message to the customer, notifying him that the work was done. It was morning. The residents of the Handon University dormitory began to wake up and go about their business. Peikin leisurely checked his morning mail and found a letter from the artist. He was very happy that the artist had finished the work on time. There was a 13-gigabyte archive in the mail. The young man started unpacking it and involuntarily thought that he didn't even know how good those sketches were. A system message appeared in front of the monitor. There were about 9,000 yuan left in the system account, and Pei Qian estimated that 3 of them would go to pay Ma Yan's salary. The young man tiredly propped his forehead with his fist and thought that he needed to use up all the system money in the remaining 8 days. A few minutes later, the unzipping procedure was successfully completed. The system speaker beeped a long time. Pei Qian reluctantly raised his head to the monitor. He was just about to doze off. He moved the computer mouse and opened the folder with the sketches. He hoped in his heart that Guanjian was really an aspiring artist, and the given style was not successful for him. The first picture was still okay. It was a graphic sketch of a mountainous landscape and was dull. But in the next painting, Pei Qian was surprised to note a fighting dragon. The artist managed to convey the play of light and shadow well. The young man immediately stopped wanting to sleep. He scrutinized the painting again and again. Qian frowned more and more. He almost cried out in frustration. The work had been done too well, and now a loss was out of the question. The dragon was so detailed that Pei Qian couldn't believe such a low price. For only 700 yuan, he had gotten a perfect sketch. The young man turned pale. There was nothing to fault. The pictures were drawn to the standard provided. Pei Qian was ready to tear his hair out. He was hurt to the point of tears because it was all drawn by an artist who drew in a completely different style. Time was running out, and so Pei Qian gathered a second urgent meeting in his head. The chairman stated that everything is gone. No later than 2 days from now, the game needs to be released. Otherwise, the system will summarize the results later. Student Pei Qian said thoughtfully that it's not all bad, because players might not like the new characters at all. The chairman agreed. He added that in using the old template, they had added little new, and the game should not be popular. Pei Qian in office clothes said that players have not seen the sketches and therefore have no way of knowing about the game. At the meeting, they decided to come up with some weird and silly name that doesn't remind us of major trends. It was behind these musings that Ma Yan caught his partner. He asked why Pei Qian was looking so seriously. Suddenly the young man realized everything. As he gazed at the screen, he exclaimed that these were the sketches for the game. There was no limit to his delight. Pei Qian told him that it was all thanks to Ma Yan. The young man was very excited. He had never imagined that he had talent before. Pei Qian asked him to test the game for bugs. He said that if there was nothing wrong with the game, it could be released. Ma Yan stomped around the table for a bit, then turned to his mentor and said that he had long wanted to know what they would call their game. Pei Qian said that they wouldn't advertise very loudly. Their regular card game will be called Ghost General. The young man glanced glumly at the cover of a game called 100 Heroes. The image wasn't bad, but the game's advertisement ruined it. All 4 artists had worked fruitfully, and Guanjian invited his friends to a cafe. They had fun chatting and drinking beer. Jian asked his friends to feel free to eat the lamb chop while it was hot. They could afford anything today. One of the guys asked what the name of the project they were trying for was, and when the game was being released. Guanjian smiled and barely remembered that it was called Ghost General, and he wasn't even interested in the release date. It turned out that all 3 of them were very interested in this question, and Jian said in a confused manner that he would look it up on the game forum now. A minute later, the artist exclaimed that the game was out. The guy with glasses said in surprise that the work had been sent in the morning, and the game had been released the same day. All 4 students broke away from their food and started searching the web for information on the game. All of them were curious to see what it was all about. The guy in glasses criticized the description in a puff of smoke. In his opinion, the words about a regular card game do not advertise the game. Another young man found information that these were the people who created that masterpiece about the lonely desert road. The third young man said that the game cost 10 yuan and asked if anyone had bought it. Jian admitted that he had bought it for the sake of interest, to see the result of his labor. After eating some meat, the young man with glasses stated that he had already completed his training and would now activate the free summoning of 10 heroes. After pressing the button, 10 avatars of divine heroes appeared, and the guy said that he had gotten 2 rare cards at once. At first he thought it was just luck. But the others also bought the game and summoned free heroes. The second guy also had 2 rare cards. Guanjian figured out the controls and did the same. 2 legendary orange cards fell to him as well. The The fourth guy was overjoyed at his good fortune. Unlike his friends, he received 3 unique hero cards. Gene scratched his head in a puzzled manner. He assumed that the game was in the testing stage, and the chance of getting rare items was much higher. A young man wearing glasses walked into the game store and told Jian with surprise that there was only a permanent premium account for 30 yuan. The second guy added that there are only 10 free hero summons daily. The third young man reminded that there are 8 account levels in the Three Kingdoms game. Guanjian decided to ask the customer. He hoped that everything would still be finalized and new features would be added to the game. The young man immediately typed a private message and asked the customer if the game provides a premium system in the future. To his surprise, the answer came virtually immediately. Pei Qian was succinct. He wrote to the artist that this was the final version of the product. Guanjian asked the young man to join the virtual chat, and they took their seats on either side of the red carpet. The artist was perplexed and said that the store only had the option of buying a VIP status for 30 yuan and nothing else. Pei Qian smiled and said that this is how it should be. They are only selling a privilege card for the members of their game. Guanjian indignantly asked why they weren't going to add other items to the in-game store. The young man explained that they had a constant price strategy. In addition, they were not going to add VIP status either. But then, they decided that someone would need it. The artist asked why hardly anyone downloads their game. He suggested that the guys haven't started promoting it yet. Pei Qian spread his hands in different directions and said that they wouldn't advertise it. Jan was very surprised. The young man made a sad face and explained that they had already spent 300,000 yuan on design, music, characters, and everything else. Pei Qian almost cried when he said that they just didn't physically have any money left, and the game simply wouldn't be promoted. Meanwhile, the art students were curious about Pei Qian's answer, and they peppered Jian with questions. The young man was silent for a while, and then stood up from the table and loudly announced that the Phantom General needed their help. All 3 of them stared at him in surprise, and Guanjian began to explain, stammering slightly, what they had managed to find out in the conversation. At the very beginning of their communication, Pei Qian looked very rich. He didn't ask for a discount on the service. On the contrary, he even offered to pay more. The young man with glasses sipped his beer and reasonably remarked that Pei Qian had already invested a lot, and now he probably wanted to make some money. Guanjian introduced his client in a strict black suit. He proudly stared into the distance, completely oblivious to the world around him. Guanjian suggested that Pei Qian was too honest, and that's why he was ashamed of dirty money. The young people started a conversation that it would be a good idea to help promote the game. The problem was that they didn't have the funds. Guanjian imperiously slammed his palm on the table. No matter what, he was going to help the guy unwind. He told his partners that Pei Qian had paid them generously at one time, so they should help him in his time of need. Qin said there are many famous artists studying in his group, and he will try to persuade them to join the promotion of the game. It was late evening. The sky was overcast and seemed very gloomy because of the pink glare. In the dormitory, the friends were talking animatedly. Mayan said with annoyance that the game turned out pretty bad since no one is interested in it or buying it. He added resentfully that many new games have several million downloads each, while their brainchild only has a few grand. Pei Qian put a hand on his friend's shoulder and said encouragingly that they had everything ahead of them. Many hits had gone through such a phase. Pei Qian smiled to himself. He happily thought that there shouldn't be any downloads since no one was promoting the game. Ma Yun sighed heavily and decided to check again just in case, hoping that someone else had bought their marvelous game. Pei Qian opened the bottle of water with a satisfied face. He knew that even after 3 months, no one would pay attention to this creepiness. The young man began to drink the water, thinking about the fact that he would soon receive 300,000. Suddenly, Ma Yan called out to him in a concerned voice. The young man's eyes were beaming with delight. He exclaimed that the number of downloads had increased, and many users were giving the game a maximum rating. Pei Qian choked and immediately spat out what he had drunk. He couldn't believe that it was true because he had thought of everything. All his excitement immediately disappeared. Pei Qian asked if Ma Yan had accidentally made a joke. There was simply nowhere for the downloads to come from. The game became popular very quickly. After a few days, more than 1,000 players left a positive evaluation of the game. Judging by one player's comment, he spent over 60 hours in the game and yet thought it was the best product in recent memory. Pei Qian couldn't believe his eyes. His game had already been bought by several thousand people, and almost all of them were giving it the maximum rating. The young man became very ill. His vision blurred, and his legs began to shake. He leaned on the surface of the table to keep from falling. He somehow made it to the bed and collapsed face down, resentfully jamming his face into the pillow. Pei Qian couldn't understand what was going on. He really wanted to give it all back and hide from the world, so the young man involuntarily hid his face under the pillow. But he had no peace here either. Ma Yan ran into the room and excitedly started calling for his best friend. Qian pretended not to hear, but Ma Yan continued to make noise, and Pei Qian unhappily peeked out from under the pillow and asked what was wrong. The joyful young man said that the hard times are over and the game is becoming popular. But you should not relax. It is not good for your health. Pei Qian immediately portrayed a happy smile. In fact, the young man was just desperate. He had failed to earn money again. Turning around a bit, Pei Qian stood up and swung his legs off the bed. There was nothing he could do anyway, and they wouldn't let him sleep anyway. The young man walked to the computer table and moved his chair with determination. He couldn't believe that a failed project had become famous, so it should have been scrutinized at what point his loss plan went down the wrong path and the game began to be bought. Suddenly an unbidden hunch appeared in the young man's mind. He began to realize little by little what was the cause of the failure. Too many comments had less to do with the game itself than with the playable characters. A lot of people bought the game because of them. The only issue was that none of the players had seen the artwork before, so the young man decided to track down where the leak had occurred. He pounded his fist on the keyboard in frustration and searched online for reviews of his brilliant game. Nothing interesting came up. Pei Qian typed the name of his game into the search box and entered the forum, where players were busily discussing game designs. A lot of game experts argued with each other over which work was done better. One of the pages revealed that first dragon sketch. Pei Qian now no longer had any doubts. He was surprised to realize that that artist, Guan Jian, was to blame for the success of the game. The enraged young man could not understand why the artist was promoting his game. After all, he had plenty of his own things to do. Pei Qian wrote a private message to Jian and clarified whether he had helped Ghost General's advancement. The artist immediately wrote back. Turns out, he asked a couple of people he knew to share the recordings among his own. Especially since the game isn't bad. Pei Qian gritted his teeth in anger. This Guan Jian had really done him a bearish favor. The young man politely thanked the artist, and Guan Jian hoped that they would continue to cooperate in the future. Another week passed unnoticed. Pei Qian stood on the balcony of the dormitory and remembered that there was a system upgrade due today. The young man looked thoughtfully into the distance and tried to guess how much money the system would calculate for him this time. Pei Qian downloaded the system messages. This time, there was 500,000 yuan in the system account and about 2,000 yuan in his personal account. The young man immediately realized that this 500,000 was derived from the sales of the game. But that only hindered him. His personal earnings were negligible. Unable to bear it, Pei Qian grimaced and cried. He was hurt to the point of tears that he couldn't even create a loss-making business. Scratching his head, Pei Qian estimated that he would earn even more next week. And the summation wouldn't be until 3 months later. With a rapidly growing income, it was worth thinking about bigger expenses. For example, you could rent an office for 400,000. Another 200,000 when Pei Qian had budgeted for the salaries of the future 30 employees he would hire to handle the tasks. In addition, it is necessary to buy expensive equipment, and then the price for everything will obviously reach 1 million. Pei Qian worriedly pondered over everything. Never before had he ever thought about how much labor it cost to set up a business with employees. He was distracted from his thoughts by Ma Yan and gave him a friendly clap on the shoulder. Pei Qian flinched in surprise, but didn't show it. Ma Yan looked very happy. He happily said that the game was quickly becoming popular and they could eat delicacies. Pei Qian smiled. He remembered that he himself had promised to treat the guy well when they started earning a decent income. Walking down the stairs, Ma Yan worriedly said that Pei Qian was constantly thinking about something despite their resounding success. The young man smiled and replied that he was just very tired lately and needed a little rest. Ma Yan gently moved his partner's elbow and said that he should take more care of himself and hire an assistant to do all the work. Ma Yan imagined a pretty girl and explained that in many TV series, the assistant does all the work and the director flirts with the girls. The young man liked the idea very much. He decided that he would hire a beautiful assistant and she would help him spend the money quickly. Pei Qian cheerfully told the surprised Yang that he was a genius, and he really needed an assistant who would do everything professionally. Ideally, the assistant would take care of all the work of renting an office, hiring employees, and purchasing equipment. Deciding not to waste any time, Pei Qian went in search of a female employee and came to the recruitment agency of Jinzhou City. A solid-looking man came out of the office door. He introduced himself as Lawrence and said he was the company's regional manager. The men shook hands. Pei Tian explained that he was looking for a suitable office assistant. The two made themselves comfortable, and Lawrence asked if the client had any special requests. Pei Tian said he wanted the highest paid assistant. Lawrence brought some files from the office and spread them out on the table. A photo of a dark-haired girl was taped to the top form. Pei Tian scrutinized each form, paying special attention to the girl's appearance. Lawrence assured that these were the best candidates in the district. Agency staff recognized them as competent. In addition, they are well-spoken. They all have an impeccable demeanor. Taking the top file, the young man asked why Shin-Hailu had quit her job as assistant vice president of a foreign company. Lawrence faintly sighed and assumed that Pei Tian rarely watched television news. Pei Tian didn't understand the connection between the news and the girl at all, and so he looked at manager Lawrence in surprise. It turned out that the vice president had drunkenly harassed the girl. But this time, he had no luck. She fought back and beat him up. After the incident, the man was fired, and Shin-Hailu's assistant herself resigned of her own accord. Pei Tian realized that this was the girl he needed. He exclaimed that he would hire her, but on one condition. Lawrence smiled and nodded to the young man. He said they could always disapprove additional requests from customers. The helper was to follow the young man's instructions and only offer her services when asked to do so. Lawrence smiled understandingly and reported that this was the professionalism expected of a chief assistant. 3 days had passed. It was Monday. On this date, Pei Tian had scheduled a move to his new office in the center of Jinzhou. A large black SUV slowly pulled up to the office high-rise buildings. A car of this brand was a great rarity. That's why passers-by just gasped when they saw such luxury right in the center of the city. It had obviously cost the owner a lot of money. The driver's side door swung open, and a long leg ending in black high stiletto-heeled shoes dropped to the pavement. It was Shin-Hailu, the head assistant of Tengda Network Company. She was hired with a salary of 30,000 yuan. The girl with a clear step demonstrated a perfect gait with a straight back and walked around the car. Hailu walked to the passenger side door on the front seat and pulled the door handle in a memorized gesture. The girl smiled politely and bowed faintly, informing the boss that they had arrived at the location. A surprised Pei Tian got out of the car. He had long heard about Shenhua's luxurious building, but he hadn't been here before. It was rumored to be the most expensive building in the entire city. Together with his assistant, Pei Tian entered the building. One of the receptionists kindly offered his assistance and took them to the 17th floor. In order to prevent other companies from interfering with his office, the man advised the young man to rent the entire floor. Pei Tian stood at the very window and looked at the nearby surroundings. The windows were very large, and he liked that. There was a superb view of a mountainous area with a small lake. The young man said that the offer suited him. The administrator explained that they only allow you to pay a month's rent in advance. The payment will be monthly. Pei Tian reluctantly turned away from the window with the delightful landscape. He turned his head and inquired about the rent. The administrator smiled and showed 4 fingers. He said the price was 4 yuan per square meter. He said that the price was expensive, but their company guaranteed the quality. Pei Tian was not satisfied. This price was too low for him. The young man quickly estimated in his mind that the entire floor would cost him 450,000 yuan. The administrator was a little jealous of his money. In addition, it would actually cost 360,000 to rent, as the young man had originally counted at 5 yuan per square meter. The receptionist smiled welcomingly and asked the young man if he liked the place. He could not miss such a customer. Without thinking long, Pei Tian blurted out that he would rent the entire floor. He decided to rent the office for as long as he could afford. The administrator was pleased and offered to sign the contract right away. He was already calculating his income from the deal. The man left, and Pei Tian, along with Hai Liu, stood in the center of the large hall looking at the furnishings. The girl stood with a notepad and wrote down every word the boss said. Chen said that they needed to take care of a good environment for the employees. The first thing to take care of was the office desk for the employees. It had to be expensive and stylish. Pei Tian asked to purchase the best computer for each staff member and 2 monitors for greater convenience. In addition, the office should have enough plants that are pleasing to the eye. For this, they will hire a full-time gardener. One of the rooms had a lot of free space by the windows, so Pei Tian decided to set up a small gym there. In the reception area, the director ordered a sofa and a coffee table, with a set of high-quality tableware, as well as the purchase of several types of tea and coffee. Hailu carefully wrote down all the wishes and asked how much money the company allocated for all these purchases. Pei Tian hesitated for a moment. He knew that he definitely had 500,000 and assumed that he could spare 800,000 yuan. The young man was very satisfied. Including the room rent and upcoming purchases, he had already successfully spent 1.5 million won. Of course, a big boss just has to look impeccable. So Pei Qian and his secretary went to the best clothing store. The girl helped him choose a worthy suit from the latest collection of one of the maestros of fashion. Pei Qian matched the suit with his watch. After hesitating a bit, the young man tried on a tie with a lighter shade and decided it would match his white shirt. The girl advised to take cream shoes of a famous fashion designer. His products were famous for their reliability and uniqueness. Pei Qian walked over to the large mirror and looked at his reflection with surprise. He had never worn strict clothes before. The girl understood his doubts in her own way and told him that this brand has been known for a century for its tailoring. Hilo suggested looking for a more expensive suit, but Pei Qian refused, reasoning that he liked this one too. The girl explained that 2 more suits needed to be purchased for formal events and for every day in the office. During the conversation, the system didn't protest, which meant that Pei Qian could still spend money at his discretion. Hilo asked the assistant at the store to pick up 2 versions of each costume with different accessories as soon as possible. The girl immediately began to take the young man's measurements. Pei Qian was satisfied. He would be able to splurge well on 4 suits. Hilo offered her help with shopping for casual outfits since Pei Qian is constantly busy with work. Pei Qian stood at the mirror and thought commendably of the assistant's professionalism. The assistant was taking a measurement from his foot. Shopping dragged on for a long time, and so the future team did not leave for the return trip across the bridge until late in the evening. Hilo handed the young man the tablet and asked him to look at the shopping list she had made during the last conversation. Pei Qian took a quick look at the description of the purchases and lingered on the computer equipment. The comfort for employees cost 600,000 won. Hailu smiled and informed the boss that all the goods were purchased from reliable sources and at wholesale prices. She had personally taken care of it. While the young man was looking at everything, the girl carefully pulled into a parking lot near one of the gated complexes. Pei Qian looked at the many barriers and carved gates with astonishment. There seemed to be an atmosphere of splendor emanating from the complex. Hailu handed the boss a small rare leather case in her hands. She explained that she had rented a 2-room apartment on his instructions. The case contained an access card and a key. The young man could have avoided buying himself expensive clothes, but it affected the overall prestige of the company. Hailu smiled and advised the boss to get some better rest. She promised to deliver the clothes in a few days. Pei Qian reported that he will start accepting applicants in the small meeting room next week, and everything should be ready by then. Hailu smiled dazzlingly and promised her boss to do everything in the best way. It was her job. The assistant dropped the young man off at the entrance of the complex and turned around to go in the other direction. Pei Qian looked at her thoughtfully. The young man walked leisurely down the sidewalk and thought about the fact that his clothes and lodging were taken care of. Now it was time to hire staff. Pei Qian imagined a solid man and decided that this type of employee wouldn't suit him. It would ruin his plans. On the other hand, punks who deny everything didn't suit him either. After all, without products, the system would not give the next batch of money. The young man thought that he could just post the vacancy online and then people who thought they were worthy candidates would come forward. Pei Qian finally remembered. This year, there was another unrecognized genius at the university, not much different from Ma Yan. The young man was walking through the grounds of Handan University. There wasn't a soul on the street, and all the summer tables were vacant. On the second floor of the dormitory, one of the students had put a tape recorder outside, and modern music was pouring out from there. Pei Qian remembered that that guy always wore the same clothes in both summer and winter. Besides, he was the easiest to find in an internet cafe. Tian walked into the cafe, looking around. At that time, the guy was expelled in his 2nd year, and the young man had to make a living by selling in-game items. Suddenly, his eyes lit up with excitement. That gambler was sitting in his usual seat. Pei Qian was glad that he found him quickly. At that time, even though his name was Bao Shu, no one called him other than the Emperor of Grinding. He was still sitting in the same clothes as before. Bao Hu was staring intently at the screen. He seemed to be playing some kind of card game. Pei Qian called out to the guy, but Shu had a headset on his head and he couldn't hear. Qian called out louder to his acquaintance. The shaggy-haired young man perplexedly took off his headphones and looked at the visitor. The face seemed completely unfamiliar to him. Bao Hu worriedly pointed a finger at his face and asked if the guy was really looking for him. Pei Qian smirked and said that he had a job to do. The young man hoped that the system would not resist his plans, especially since this guy is useless. He can only play games, but he doesn't know anything about development. Bao Yu lazily raised his head and said that the manager job at the internet cafe didn't interest him at all. Pei-Qian put a wad of banknotes on the table and replied that he was offering a job as a designer. If he accepts, it's an upfront payment. He knew what to buy the fat man with and said that his company had the best dual-monitor computers, and Bao Shu would be able to play games there. The young man was very surprised. The sentence looked too suspicious. Bao Shu asked what his duties were. Pei-Qian stated that he should just play different games and report problems if any are found. Besides, he could also participate in game development if he wanted to. Qian assumed that Shu could do that. Bao Shu could no longer resist the temptation. He tilted his head and looked at the floor. With a quiet voice, the young man gave his consent. Pei-Qian rubbed his shoulder and said that with that 1,000 won, he could get a haircut, take a bath, and buy some clothes. The young man left the internet cafe and waved goodbye. Pei-Qian said that his company was located in Shenhua. Bao Shu still couldn't believe his luck and reached for the money with a trembling hand. Qian asked the young man to keep in touch at all times. Bao Shu couldn't stand it and burst into tears. He had long forgotten what real work was like, let alone an office with computer games. Clutching the banknotes in his fist, the young man collapsed exhaustedly on the table. It was very hard to believe that his skills were appreciated by someone. The next day, several new people arrived at the Chenhua high-rise buildings. All of them were looking for jobs with Pei-Qian. The young guy with fiery red hair was no exception. He had heard about an interesting job and was now looking at a huge building. Huang Sibo had a vacancy as a system administrator with a salary of 1,500 yuan. Even he couldn't believe that a modest company had set up an office here. Everything here was very chic. The young man immediately noticed that everyone around him wore strict suits, while he arrived in shorts and a t-shirt. Juan wanted to hide somewhere. Things here looked a level better than his recent surroundings. Trying not to look at anyone, the young man took a quick step across the hall and pressed the elevator button. Luckily, there was no one around. A minute later, the red light came on. A beeping sound warned of the elevator's arrival at the floor, and Sibo took his position in front of the doors. The elevator doors opened, and the head administrator, Old Man Liu, who worked in the same company as Sibo, stepped out. He was very surprised to see the young man. Sibo's own eyes nearly popped out of his orbits. He was sure he was the only applicant for the job. Stammering, the young man gave a pathetic smile and gave out a greeting. Old Man Liu looked at him angrily. He smirked and said that Tengda Company had very high requirements, and there was no way the young man would be taken there. Liu instructively said that Sibo's tasks were arranged ineffectively since he took the time to be interviewed. Juan Sibo turned pale. He simply didn't know what to say to such an attack, especially since the old man was really right. He didn't work hard enough. The young man stared back at his mentor in astonishment. He had never imagined that old Liu would come to interview at the same company. Stepping into the elevator, Juan Sibo programmed a trip to the 17th floor. The old man spoiled his mood a little. The young man realized that Liu didn't pass the interview, so he didn't stand much of a chance either. The worst part was that the boss would take revenge when Sibo went back. The young man was stopped in a large, spacious hallway by the girls at the reception desk. He stammered his name and said he was invited for an interview. The girls behind the counter were very pretty, and Juan Sibo involuntarily blushed. Besides, they looked like twins. One of the girls asked to wait while she announced the young man's arrival. The second girl smiled and offered to follow her. Their sympathy was mutual. The girl deliberately walked a little ahead so that the young man would not notice how much she was blushing. Juan Sibo had never been in such a large and luxurious office before. There were 2 monitors at each workstation. In addition, binders and paper fillers had been prepared in advance, and all of it was dazzlingly clean. There was a long and comfortable table for each employee, near which ergonomic chairs on casters stood. The reception girl accompanying Huang Sibo knocked softly but firmly on the door. No one answered the door. The girl asked if she could come in. Sibo kept behind the girl's back, admiring the splendor of this company. Pei-Qian, the director of the company, sat against the wall in a comfortable leather chair. In front of him was a small round table with a set of dishes. Qian smiled and clarified whether the young man's name was really Huang Sibo. He introduced himself as the president of Tengda Company. The young man said hello and timidly began to take a seat on the large semi-oval couch. He was a little uncomfortable. Pei-Qian saw his confusion and asked him to make himself at home. He offered the young man a taste of his green tea. Sibo gratefully accepted the offer and suddenly realized that the cup was pure silver. The young man thought that Qian didn't care about money at all. Pei-Qian took a small sip and asked the young man to briefly talk about his experience in the game industry. Juan Sibo turned pale. He had nothing to brag about. The young man honestly said that until this day, he had been working at Shan Gaim's company. A faint smile appeared on the headmaster's face, and if Sibo hadn't been watching him, he wouldn't have even noticed. Meanwhile, Peikin was smiling more and more. And the young man couldn't understand what the company president was smiling so much about. Huang Sibo wrote it off as him being just a rookie, and Pei Qian condescendingly assessed his career. Pei Qian smiled at the young man even more and said that it was fine with him. Sibo did not immediately believe his happiness. The president looked at the young man seriously and said that Sibo met the company's requirements. He asked when Huan could start. Huang Sibo was almost speechless at this stunning news. Stammering with excitement, he asked for 2 days. Peikin asked the young man to bring the documents to sign the contract. He asked Sibo about the expected salary level. The young man was not completely comfortable, as he had only worked in the game industry for half a year, but he still asked for 2,100 yuan a month. Peikin sighed heavily. He placed the teacup on the table and picked up a piece of paper lying on his desk. President Qian frowned and propped his forehead with his hand. Huang Sherbo was startled to think that he had asked too much for his level. Clenching his teeth, the young man called on all the gods of the world to make sure that his paycheck would not be less than what he used to receive. Meanwhile, President Qian said thoughtfully that renting a room in Jinzhou would cost 100 yuan, and the cost of food came to 800. In addition, he included the cost of clothing and utility bills, and threw another 500 yuan on top. Knowing the needs of the young men, the president did not forget about their girls and budgeted an extra 300 yuan per month. While Huan Sibo listened in amazement to his future boss, he added more travel reimbursement and savings in the bank. With all of the above in mind, President Qian found it reasonable to offer the employee a salary of at least 3,500 yuan. He had noticed that his company paid an order of magnitude higher than the other places. Huan Sibo could not believe that he had been promised so much. Showing 4 fingers, President Qian said that he intended to offer the future employee a salary of 4,000 yuan. Huan Sibo listened to him stunned. The sudden happiness almost made him faint. He wondered how other rich people behaved. He barely managed to pull himself together. Trying to look casual, Sibo replied, stammering a little, that he liked the offer. The president exclaimed that in that case, he was glad to welcome the young man into the company of the Tengda, and shook Sibo's hand firmly. Shoving his hands in his pockets, the young man walked out of his boss's office, trying to look casual. In fact, his legs were shaking. The automatic sashes of the doors of the presidential office closed noisily behind the dazed visitor. No one could see Qian's happy face. He had just talked to several candidates and had to choose the most unsuitable ones. Peikin took out a pen and quickly began to make notes on the employee candidate forms. Naturally, he didn't need old man Liu with good experience. He could undo all the well-prepared work. But the young and green Huang Sibo was just the kind of employee who didn't know much about anything. So Qian hired him. Peikin stretched his arms and neck a little and stretched. He thought that it was a good start, and at this pace, he would be able to release the next project in time. Another week passed. The same beautiful twin sat at the reception desk and smiled dazzlingly at all visitors. Ma Yan decided to visit his mentor and walked into the office. All the seats were already occupied and the staff were hard at work. When Ma Yan passed by some girl, she was just shouting angrily to someone that she would kill him for an action committed in the game. Another young man shouted to his neighbor that he was playing well and asked him to add him as a friend. Bao Shu gave him his game ID. Surprised by this kind of scope, Ma Yan cautiously opened the door of the president's office and alerted the director that he was coming in. Peike was comfortably sprawled on the sofa with his phone in his hands. He greeted the young man cheerfully and offered him some tea. Ma Yan did not refuse the excellent tea. He noticed that his office was highly productive and almost all the seats were occupied. Peikin said his hiring of job candidates was going well and handed his friend a stack of questionnaires with resumes of his employees. Looking at the top form, Ma Yan first thought that it was pure chance and the employee had other needed skills. But in the next dossier, the situation was repeated. This employee also had no experience in the game industry and was self-taught. Ma Yan couldn't believe his eyes and went through all the forms one by one. Only now was he able to appreciate the horror of the situation. He puzzledly asked the director why he wanted people with absolutely no experience in a prestigious company. It seemed routine for the young man to increase the budget and find decent people, including the head designer. After hesitating for a moment, Peikin replied that there were already applicants for the head designer position, but he had turned them all down. Ma Yan was greatly surprised. He sat in the chair and glared at the company president, so Pei Qian stood up and turned aside. The director explained that all the candidates had the same serious flaw. They had the wrong way of thinking and lacked creativity. In addition, each of the candidates demanded exorbitant salaries with little skill and ability. Now Ma Yan understood. Such people are really ballast in their company, making absolutely no effort to develop it. But still, the most important criterion Pei Chen considered was completely different. Those people had completely cooled down to gambling. Ma Yan understood that any company should have a chief designer, and was surprised to ask who would be in charge of the project. President Pei Chen plopped down on the sofa, tiredly closed his eyes and sighed heavily. Ma Yan looked at his friend worriedly. Pei Chen raised his head, smiled with a full mouth, and exclaimed that the project would be managed personally. There was no one else. Ma Yan excitedly remarked that the president already had a lot of things to do, and he definitely needed the head designer to help out a bit. Pei Chen revealed that there was already an assistant. A guy named Huang Sibo is doing a great job. Of course, he wasn't going to hire a head designer who would spot the company's flaws at a glance. Ma Yan took Sibo's questionnaire and incredulously wondered if he could handle it after 6 months as a system administrator. Pei Chen replied that it was completely unimportant. Right now, one should only pay attention to how Huang Shibo was doing here. The president said that Sibo created 80% of the data using a cloud editor, and he could be considered a designer. Ma Yan decided to reconsider his attitude towards the guy and exclaimed that he should be paid the salary of a chief designer, not 4,000 yuan. Pei Chen thoughtfully said that he had already thought about it, but decided to take his time and look at the guy. Adding the salary could be added later. The president exclaimed that other employees also have special talents. He cited Bao Shu as an example. In the world of fantasy gaming, he is a guru. The young man has 6 fully pumped accounts with all classes and races. Ma Yan enthusiastically agreed that this person was indispensable to their team as well, and asked when they would start working on the project. Pei Chen said that they had already lost some time, so they would start full-scale work right tomorrow. Pei Chen walked out of the office and looked around at all the employees, then loudly asked everyone to stop working. He had an important announcement to make. Director Chen stood outside the door to his office and smiled dazzlingly. His voice couldn't be mistaken for any other. All the employees were happy to see the president of the company. The girl who threatened to kill her partner for acting in the game smiled at the director. The other players also stared at the boss in amazement. The twins started whispering among themselves that the president himself had come out to see them. President Pei Chen made sure that everyone had gotten off the case and was looking at him. The director coughed meaningfully into his fist. He said the team has had ample time to prepare for the work, and so work on the project begins tomorrow. All the staff members applauded. Huan Sibo tried the hardest. He was willing to stay up nights, but he was willing to work hard. The young man imagined himself as a masochist, because he now had to work hard, from 9 in the morning to 9 in the evening 6 days a week. Nevertheless, Sibo believed that it was possible to work in such a regime, given the level of labor comfort and high wages. The president raised his hand high up and exclaimed that that was all for today. Since they had a lot of work to do, everyone could go home. Huan Sibo looked at his boss perplexed. It wasn't that he was completely against it, it was just a little unusual. Pei Chen decided that it was okay to go home early on Friday. And then there would be 2 days off, and that was pretty good. Leaving his workplace, the young man looked at his watch and was surprised to notice that it was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were already on their way home. The weekend went by pretty quickly. Monday evening came. Pei Chen had been in his luxurious apartment the whole time. He was lying on the corner sofa with his legs comfortably curled up and enjoying a good night's rest. There would be a lot of work to do tomorrow. Holding a chilled can of Coke in his hands, Pei Chen still couldn't decide which game to publish to definitely go broke. Pei Chen called another meeting in his head. Striking the table with a wooden gavel, the chairman announced its opening. The chairman put his palm to his cheek and asked glumly, who wished to speak? As last time, a student was given the floor. The student stated that this time, the task is more difficult. It is necessary to choose a losing option in advance so that the staff would not understand anything. One of the clones sipped some coffee and suggested that we just don't do mobile gaming, since the industry is at its peak right now. Pei Chen with the gamepad suggested creating an MMORPG like Fantasy World. He outlined a green orc with a large halberd. The student said that this idea is not to his liking. They might accidentally create a hit like the first part of the Eastern Legend game. Pei Chen seized on this thought and slammed his cup on the table, splashing the coffee. He suggested doing just such a game. Pei Chen with a gamepad said that it is not a bad idea. There are plenty of such games in the market. The chairman agreed with the reasoning. The student reprimanded that the requirements for such projects are very high, and their company will not come out on top. During the heated discussion, it was decided to add a few additions so that the project would definitely be recognized as a failure. It was Tuesday, November 12th. The Shenhua office building was bustling with activity. On the 17th floor, everything was just beginning. Pei Qin, the president of Tengda Company, called all the employees to a meeting. They were all seated in a large hall around a long table. On the left side closer to him, Pei Qin sat down the main slackers Huang Sibo, Bao Xiai, and one other person. They were ready to write everything down. On her right hand sat Hai Lu's faithful assistant with a notebook. Behind her, Ma Yang and another young man sat with their notebooks open. Coughing habitually into his fist, Pei Qin made it clear that he was about to speak. He stated that this time, they were going to make a first-person shooter. Huang Sibo was very surprised. He admitted that Ghost General was not a bad game, but the shooter was a completely different project. It seemed to the young man that this was not quite the right approach. After some thought, he timidly approached the president. Pei Qin guessed what he was talking about and stopped him with a hand gesture. The man made it clear to the audience that he would not engage in mobile gaming. President Pei Qin exclaimed that their goal is to gain global recognition and they cannot engage in unremarkable mobile games. The young man shouted that they had only two choices. They must either play big or pack up and go home. All the members of the meeting smiled and started clapping loudly. Pei Qin made a proper impression on the staff, and they liked the speech. Huang Sibo looked at his new boss with undisguised delight. He now saw that Pei Qin was a level above his former director. Pei Qin thought for a while and smiled slyly. He said that Huang Sibo and Bao Shu would manage the project. Sibo was to take over as the head administrator, and Bao Shu was to handle the design. Sibo almost lost his head. All of a sudden, he went from being a system administrator to being a chief administrator, which took about 6 years. Pei Qin raised his hand up and showed 3 fingers for everyone to see. He said that he only had 3 requirements for the future game. First of all, there has to be a story. You don't need to emphasize team battles. The game should have depth and substance. Secondly, you need to take into consideration the feelings of new players. This shooter should be easy to operate. The designers of the project couldn't imagine how to do that, and Qian also wanted to add epic weapons to the game. Pei Qin dazzlingly smiled at the staff and asked if anyone had any questions. It seemed like he was willing to cooperate, but as soon as Huang raised his hand and started a question, Qian casually turned the other way as if by accident and said loudly that no one had any questions. The employees clapped loudly at company president Tengda, and a silent guess lingered in everyone's mind that he didn't even want to listen. Pei Qin got up from the table and stated that he was giving the designers a week to get all the sketches done. Bao Shu was in charge of the creative part and the main directions of the game. The young man immediately wrote everything down without missing a word. Huang Sibo was responsible for finalizing the project and assigning tasks to the other employees. Sibo immediately made the necessary notes. Turning to Ma Yan, the president ordered the young man to learn from the others' work and help them if possible. Pei Qin waved goodbye to the staff and asked them to contact him in case of difficulties, especially financial difficulties. Pei Qin himself thought that his project must be a failure. It was already enough that the weapon cost almost 1,000 yen. Besides, there has been a more successful team-based shooter for a long time, and it makes the player feel like a fish in water. Pei Qin opened the doors to his office, perfectly aware that there was simply no future for such a game. There was a lot of money to be spent on creating a story. He imagined his designers consulting amongst themselves, and thought that no one on the team had experience making shooters. So it will be very strange if such a game reaches the testing stage and is released. Slamming the double doors to the office behind him, Pei Qin allowed himself to relax. He was sure that he wouldn't be able to make any money. An ominous moon loomed over the city. It was late at night, but the lights were still on the 17th floor of the office. Huang Sibo worked without sparing his health. He even ate on the go. There was a bag of cookies and a large glass with a drink by the keyboard. The young man decided to work on his conscience and was ready to work overtime. Despite the boss's prohibition to lower the wages of those who work longer than necessary, Bao Shu came over with some sketches and informed the young man that his sketches were almost complete. There were some obscure diagrams mixed in with the text on the sheet, and Huang Sibo was surprised. Shu had done a good job. Sibo stood up from the table and pulled his chair back, rolling it closer to Bao Shu. Huang Sibo asked Bao Shu to sit down for a while, as he had a serious conversation. Shu was very surprised, but sat down on the chair. Bao started to speak first. He had his own thoughts on foreign games looking in an order of magnitude better. Juan Sibo listened attentively to his partner and nodded satisfied. It turned out that they were thinking in the same direction. Bao was absolutely certain that Pei Qian was just testing them and suggested that they focus on the small budget as much as possible. In shooters, the main character model is not needed at all. They're where all life is through the scope. If they make a shooter about zombies, they can create different kinds of enemies using the same model. Juan Sibao was beginning to see where his partner was going with this. It was a great budget saver, but they still needed secondary characters. It turned out that Bao Shu had taken care of that too. According to him, it was enough to introduce only one girl, whom he made mute. It sounded like thunder. Sibo didn't understand why a minor character had to be mute. Bao Yu explained that in that case, she would not need to be voiced. Her facial expressions and actions would easily complement the overall plot. His plan is for the girl to support the protagonist while all the other players are killing zombies and mercenaries. In addition, you can insert many puzzles that only this dumb girl can handle. Huang Sibo was impressed by the magnificent plot and recognized that Shu had come up with a good idea. The story was set in a fortress in the middle of the sea. After the corporations experiment with a virus, the protagonist must reach the top floor of the fortress for the escape to succeed. Therefore, a lot of textures will not have to be drawn. All locations will be reduced only to the rooms of the fortress and corridors. In some places, the walls and floor will be covered with poisonous traces of the virus, and the hero will have to move quickly and carefully. You will also come across partially or completely destroyed rooms and laboratories along the way. There may be danger in them. The main idea was to use only one location. With a little bit of texture remodeling, you could get a different room. Juan Sibo's fingers ran quickly over the keyboard. He was modeling a future project, listening attentively to his interlocutor. Bao Shu said that virtually all the cutscenes could be filmed in one location and save a lot of money. Sibo liked that very much. The guys quickly found common ground and developed a plot about a girl kidnapped by corporations because she is immune. In addition, the girl will grow weaker as she helps the player, and so the protagonist himself needs to grow stronger. Huang Sibo was impressed with the talent and said Bao managed to make a super story with a limited budget. The young man objected that there was nothing unusual here. He was only following the instructions of the president of the company. Huang Sibo smiled and noticed that Bao Shu was very humble. After all, the principal had 3 requirements, and Bao managed to fulfill them all. He remembered the firm and purposeful figure of the president, and decided that the direction for a small budget had been set from the beginning. Sibo asked what Bao thought to do about the rest of the requirements. The young man replied that it was easily eliminated in the sensitivity settings of the gaming devices. As for the weapons, it was simply the result of the boss's high ambition. Huan Chibo asked for a more detailed explanation. Bao Yu revealed that the epic weapon cost 888 yuan. This means that there will be other weapons in the game that are simpler. Thus, Pei Qian hints that the weapons will have different levels and characteristics, but he will only sell the epic ones. Huan Sibo got the idea. They need to come up with different ways to get weapons and maximize playing time by doing so. The guys had a late-night discussion about the game's strategy and left the office after midnight, remembering to turn off the lights. Huan Sibo even worked on the project at home, wanting not to disappoint his boss. After all, he had purposely provided them with a puzzle on a limited budget. The young man still worked half a night in the editor, realizing that he had to get the job done perfectly, for the president had hoped for designers. 2 days passed. The work in the office went on as usual. The glare from the sunlight was visible on the building from afar. Tengda employees gathered in a large conference room and took turns giving presentations on what they had accomplished. Pei Qian almost fell asleep from boredom. He had long since gotten bored of listening to this, and would have long since left for the office to play a little if it wasn't for the status. There wasn't much entertainment. Cyan, the young man took out his cell phone and launched one of his favorite games. Suddenly, a notification interrupted the loading of the game, and Pei Qian grumbled unhappily. The text of the message surprised him greatly. One of the designers sent him a sketch he had started, and it should have been approved so that the young man could work further. Pei Qian estimated that the guy had managed in 2 days and wondered if it was a lot or not. At any rate, it was worth looking at. The designers did a good job and sent a long script. The young man grimaced. It wasn't easy to read from his phone. The director was interested in whether his game designers had been able to cope with the requirements put forward. It turned out that the guys had thought of everything. The plot was pretty good at first glance, and it took about 3 hours to get through it. The designers didn't forget about lowering the difficulty level. This was adjusted quite simply according to the player's wishes. His favorite thing with epic elite weapons was also present. At their own risk, the guys added their weapon mining system as well. Pei Chen smiled. Everything was going according to plan, according to his requirements. It seemed like this was going to be the one failed project. The young man immediately typed back. He recognized that the designers had done a good job, and the direction was right. Despite the company president's ban on working late, employees were not even going to leave the office that day. Baoshu was passionately testing the story fragment he and his partner had created together by plugging in a game controller. He was quite satisfied with the result. There had been no malfunctions for several hours, and Baoshu typed a message for his colleague. Baowu wrote that he made a walkthrough video of the story and is interested in whether the game fits their standards. After receiving the file, Juan Sibo immediately put the headset on his head, tweaked it a bit, and started the snippet. Mayan coincidentally happened to be nearby, and he peered at the young man's monitor with astonishment. After all, it's long past office hours, and the team is still sitting in the office running benchmark tests once again. Another day had come. No one gave the appearance of being tired at work. Employees were rushing to meet deadlines, and the whole floor was working late again. Pei Qian, the president of the company, was bored in his luxurious apartment. He had absolutely nothing to do. Even the wealth transformation system didn't make him happy. The system account only increased, and the personal account had 1,000+ yuan. Pei Qian sighed and leaned back in his chair. The state of the account was worse than ever. He had never thought that money was hard to spend. Suddenly someone knocked on the door. The young man immediately perked up and shouted that it was unlocked. He was glad to have any guests now. An excited Ma Yang ran into the room. He exclaimed that the designers, along with their colleagues, were secretly working overtime on the work computers. Pei Qian immediately jumped up from his seat and asked in surprise. He didn't want to believe that his subordinates had disobeyed orders and were working at night. Pei Qian asked his interlocutor what exactly Huang Shibo was doing. He wondered whether the young man was engaged in the project outside of work hours. Unfortunately, Ma Yan was completely ignorant of the development, so he hesitantly replied that Sibo was playing games, most likely. Pei Qian exhaled with relief. Playing games at work was just a minor thing. He was more concerned with screwing up the project. Ma Yan sat down on the guest sofa, while Director Qian walked in circles around his office, pondering the staff's act. He approached his friend and asked if Ma Yang was sure that Huang Sibo was playing games on the work computer after hours. Ma Yan exclaimed that this was the reason why he had come, because the designer was wasting the company's resources, so he should be punished. Pei Qian immediately waved his hands and said that there was no need to punish those guys. He thought to himself that they could do anything as long as they didn't work. Pei Qian recalled that they work in a gaming company and the employees play with each other, sharing invaluable experience. Mayan scratched his head thoughtfully. This explained a lot of things. He asked the director if the surveillance should be continued. Pei Qian didn't answer as if he didn't hear the question. Ma Yan turned his head and was surprised to see that Pei Qian had already turned away. The president walked hurriedly through his office, leaving his employee on the couch completely unanswered. Pei Qian walked over to the table and slapped his palms on its surface with all his might. Ma Yan flinched in surprise. The president shouted that they couldn't leave their colleagues alone. Tengda Company puts the welfare of employees first. Pei Qian said their state pays extra to everyone who works overtime, and their company will do the same. The president explained that he would pay time and a half extra for overtime and double the rate for working on weekends. Without wasting any time, Pei Qian immediately printed out a list of all his employees, intentionally leaving a blank field between the names. He approached his companion with the printouts and told Ma Yan that he now had a very important assignment. Daily overtime must be recorded, and Pei Qian will then pay them all extra hourly. A shocked Ma Yan walked out of the room, pondering over his boss's words. Pei Qian stared thoughtfully at the laptop screen. As soon as the office door closed, he smiled and praised himself for the idea. Now the money would be spent even faster. Another working day was coming to an end. Having put their keyboards into the desk, the employees laid out their unpretentious dinner and had a little snack. Juan Thibault was not interested in that. He was working with full dedication and wanted to get the project to the finish line as soon as possible. When he had finished his work, the young man sighed with relief. He could have a snack later, but first he had to approve the expenses. Juan Thibault walked quickly through the office and found himself at the president's office. He knocked and announced his arrival. The young man brought an inventory of the products needed to develop their game and hesitantly asked the boss to look at the estimate. Pei Qian pretended to be busy working and took the list from the guy. He asked Huang Sibo to sit down and wait for a while. The young man's hands were trembling. He reassured himself that everything should be fine. He had saved his budget and chosen the best product for the price and quality. Pei-Kin scrutinized the price list for purchasing models for the game. He was surprised that the designers had invested $670,000. The president returned the estimate with purchases to Juan Sibo and said that the budget needed to be doubled or their game would not be ranked. The young man looked at his boss in amazement. Of course, he agreed that the budget was small, but he had meant well and had saved the company money. Juan Sibo agreed to his superior's demands and promised to make things right. In the meantime, he asked a question about the name of the game. It turned out that Bao Shu had named his creation Ocean Fortress. Sibo thought it was a little strange, so he asked his boss to come up with a name. President Chen propped his chin up with his fist and thought for a moment. The name of the game was suspiciously familiar. He had heard it somewhere before. Suddenly he remembered everything. It was the exact name of one of the movies that had failed at the box office. It had been in his past life. A good idea had formed in his mind. Pei-Kin pounded his fist on the table with all his might. His eyes gleamed with excitement. Pei-Kin exclaimed that the name Ocean Fortress actually sounded pretty good, and the name could be left. Juan Sibo was simply dumbfounded by this statement. Nevertheless, it was the boss's wish, and the young man said he would go to rule the budget. Pei-Kin was happy with the situation. None of his staff could have known that the movie with that title had only made a third of its budget. The young man pictured the mercenary with the girl on the rocky shore and thought that he could lose a couple million yuan on the failure of the game. 2 more weeks passed. It was Friday. In Tengda's office, employees were busy tweaking characters and modeling the environment. Huang Sibo approached Xiao Liu, who was experimenting with character customization, and drew his attention to a problem with the functionality. Xiao Liu picked up the bug list and looked at his interlocutor perplexedly through his glasses. He promised to fix it right away. Sibo put his hand on Liu's shoulder in a friendly manner and advised him to consult Bao about the sensitivity settings. He was an expert in that. Juan Sibo looked thoughtfully at the estimate for models and effects. The budget was now over $1.5 million and growing. The young man walked to his workplace with a dejected look. He had to redo everything lately. Juan Sibo thoughtfully pulled back the back of the comfortable chair and sat down at the computer. This time it was necessary to correct the characteristics of the object. The young man sadly thought that Pei-Kin had always been pleased with him. Therefore, he wouldn't be able to look his boss in the eye until he finished the game. It was approaching lunchtime. Suddenly, a new notification appeared on the screen of the phone that was lying nearby. Juan Sibo was surprised to realize that his paycheck had arrived. And it was quite strange, since there were still 2 days left until the end of the month. The guy knew from experience that most companies paid for the next month's work. In addition, the report revealed that Juan Sibo received $1,000+ more than his salary suggested. The young man stared at the screen in surprise, not believing his eyes. He thought that the bank had simply charged the money incorrectly. Checking his calendar, Sibo figured that he had started working for the company on the 5th, and it hadn't even been a month since he had been employed. Xinhai Liu, the assistant to the president of the company, walked past his workstation, faintly smiling to herself. Huang Sibo decided that the girl should know everything as the boss's right hand. He stood up and asked Hai Liu to give him a moment of attention. The girl turned around in surprise. Huang Sibo ran up to her and told her that there had been a mistake in the payroll. He showed a message from the bank. The young man explained that his salary for the position was 4,000 wen, and he received as much as 5. Hai Liu smiled and replied to Sibo that there was no mistake. He had overtime pay added to his salary for the overtime hours he spent at work. Huang Sibo was stunned. In a job that is a dream come true, but also includes overtime pay, Hai Liu explained that other employees in their company, not just Huang Sibo, receive extra overtime pay. The girl reminded him that Sibo had worked 50 hours on top, and informed him that after tax deduction, that was the amount. Huang Sibo could not believe his happiness. His legs began to shake. The young man was pleased that his labor was appreciated. The conversation with Hai Liu did not go unnoticed. Many employees were interested in the same question and were pleased to hear that they would receive extra pay. The girl asked if Juan Sibo wanted to ask anything else and turned around. The boy looked at her in surprise. Notifications from the bank almost immediately came to all the other employees as well. Xiao Liu stared puzzledly at the phone screen. Bao Shu simply couldn't believe such a big payout. He himself only stayed at the job if he wanted to, and the young man was pleased that his labor was appreciated. At the same time, Bao Shu realized that President Pei-Kin knew about all of their affairs despite the fact that they were working in secret, and he wept. Juan Sibo couldn't hold back either, and cried out of gratitude. The boss was well aware that his colleagues were violating the ban, but he did not fine them. What's more, he even paid the entire team extra for the hours they had worked. Sibo's whole body was trembling, and he was filled with a sense of responsibility. The young man threw his hand with his fist up and shouted loudly that from now on, everyone was obliged to work hard. They couldn't let the boss down. All the employees as one raised their fists up and shouted in one voice that they were ready to do it right. The current situation was weighing on the president. Despite his best efforts, he still could not empty the system account, so it was necessary to call another meeting on impulsive spending. The chairman declared it open. Pounding the gavel on the table, he glanced glumly at his feet and asked who wished to speak first. Student Chien raised his hand. The chairman fixed his eyes on the young man. He didn't mind that the student would speak first. He had business acumen. The student said thoughtfully that they had used up some of the money last week. The rest of the money was spent this week. Pei Chen stood up from the table, nearly knocking over a cup of water, and angrily shouted that absolutely everything had been paid, including office rent and staff allowances. Chen stated with a gamepad that even with all this, they're barely keeping up with the amount in the system account. The chairman said that Ghost General still continues to generate revenue, and that is the worst part. After a long discussion, all 5 clones laid their heads tiredly on the table. A student asked what were the proven ways of spending money. One member of the meeting, half asleep, suggested that we could have a team-building activity. The other 4 instantly perked up and raised their heads when they heard about team building. It wasn't a bad idea. Sending all 30 employees on a joint vacation could easily spend a couple thousand yuan. They decided to give this to Assistant Shin. The next day, President Pei Chen called Hailu into his office. He sat at his laptop and the girl stood in front of him with a notebook. Pei Chen asked the assistant to organize a trip for the team and plan the activities. The girl asked for more details. The young man hesitated and said he had decided to send the staff to Guangzhou to exchange experiences. It would take about 5 days. Hailu quickly wrote everything down. Chen said that the company would pay for all the tickets, accommodation, and meals for its employees. The president smiled smugly. He estimated that such a trip would cost at least a couple 100,000 yuan. Finished with her notes, the girl closed the notebook and said that she understood everything. She would take care of it as soon as possible. No one was working at Tengda Company on this day. On the verbal instruction of the company president, all employees moved to the rest area. 3 employees sat on a couch with gamepads in their hands in front of a plasma panel, and one of them incredulously asked if they were really going to Guangzhou. It turned out that the other heard that President Shin's assistant was booking tickets for everyone. Liu said that no one sends their staff to exchange experiences with another firm. A guy and a girl were talking at one of the tables. She said the company was treating them well. The young man nodded. There were some decent perks here. Another staff member asked where they would be going this time. He hoped their group would go to a Sunstrike gaming company. Shannel replied that this is most likely because that company specializes in making shooters, and they have a lot to learn from them. As if out of nowhere, Huan Sibo appeared and asked for the floor, looking at his staff with a slight reproachful look. He said that in any case, they should all think about their work first now, rather than dreaming about Guangzhou. Shallow resentfully replied that they had never been to Guangzhou, and they couldn't help but think about it, especially since a famous game studio is located there. Colleagues spoke in his support and assured Sibo that there was no need to worry. They promised to work well. Meanwhile, Hailu, the assistant to the company's president, had brilliantly completed her task and returned to the office. She placed the travel estimate on the principal's desk. After barely reading it, Pei Qian was horrified. Everything together only cost 150,000. Hailu assured the director that the entire trip is planned with strict commercial standards in mind. Pei Qian read each item on the list. The girl reported that the trip would be made at the end of December, as he had requested. Hailu reported that she ordered everything for 30 people at the rate of 300 yuan per person. The girl added that this amount already includes food, transportation costs, and extras. President Pei Qian ran his eyes over the list once more and asked if they could book first-class tickets instead of the economy option. For the first time ever, the system panel beeped and glowed red. He realized it was a system warning. Pei Qian turned pale and said that he had changed his mind. Economy class was also a good option and would suit his company quite well. Still, there was no way he could accept that a trip to another city for 30 people cost a measly 150,000 yuan. Hailu took the estimate and bowed politely. She promised to contact the company in Guangzhou City right away. From a great height, the city of Guangzhou looked very beautiful. It seemed to be just a huge net decorated with colorful lights. As we approached, that grid turned into an entire city. Billions of windows glowed simultaneously. Some high-rises were illuminated with green lights. The office of Sunstrike Game Studio looked poorer than Tengda's. There were many employees, but the workplace was not as comfortable. Jo Mu-young, the manager of the company, was genuinely surprised that Tengda Company wanted to visit their company to exchange experiences. He questioned the secretary, and the girl promptly replied that the information was correct. It was for this purpose that they were going to Guangzhou. Joe's glasses slid down his nose in inordinate surprise. He had never met a company that shared experiences with another. The girl added that this was the company that created the Ghost General game. Mu-yan was wary. He had heard about this game. The secretary suggested that Suna be sent to meet the guests. She said that the group would just walk around the office, and there was nothing to worry about. Mu-yan recalled the resounding success of that mobile game. It would be nice to meet its developers. Zhu gave his okay for Tengda's company to come. He asked the girl to make a plan, and said he would personally meet them. The secretary quickly made the appropriate notes in the diary, and said she'd get on it right away. She handed the boss a completed form and asked to see the rookie exclusion list. Joe took it with interest. Mu-yan lowered his glasses onto his nose and scrutinized the rookie's track record, associating their work with his personal observations. After making a decision, Zhou returned the list to the secretary and told the girl to fire absolutely everyone except Lin Wan. Whistling, Zhou walked away. The secretary asked in surprise why Lin Wan was staying again. But it was as if the boss didn't hear. Walking into his office, Mu-yan first took off his dark glasses, carefully wiped them and carefully placed them on the nightstand. President Zhou sat down in a comfortable chair and sighed heavily. The whole Lin Wan thing had already bored him to tears. Mu-yan closed his eyes and thought for a moment. Of course the secretary was right. There wasn't a single objective reason to keep her. Suddenly the phone rang. The president of Shenhua Corporation was calling on personal business, and Zhou assured him that he would fulfill any request. It turned out that Lin Wan is the granddaughter of the caller, so the president asked Zhou to make the girl quit on her own. Mu-yan quickly figured out that Shenhua Corporation was the most powerful corporation in the country, and it would be a good idea to gain its support. Of course, he could have gotten the girl to quit in no time, but Lin clearly wanted his granddaughter to lose interest in the gaming industry forever. For Zhou, this was easy. He had already thought of how he would rediscover the gaming industry from the inside for Lin Wan. A staff member approached the team leader, handed over the documentation, and asked to see the final result of the calculations. Timlid found the error and scattered his papers all over the office. He squealed that the young man had made a mistake in elementary calculations and would sit on the job until he got it right. Mu-yan knew that the gaming industry was like a meat grinder. The constant layoff lists and working 12 hours a day showed its essence best. He pictured the young red-haired girl in front of him and decided that she would leave on her own once she saw the true nature of the industry. Exactly 1 month later, the Tengda Company flew out in full force to the city of Guangzhou. Everyone enjoyed watching the beautiful night view of the metropolis. A fashionable hotel in the city had long since been booked, and President Pei Qian quickly settled the staff into rooms. Pei Qin and Ma Yan were chatting on the comfortable corner sofa in the presidential suite. Ma Yan complained that he was tired of pretending. He was tired of hiding the fact that they had known each other for a long time. Besides, in the presence of strangers, he must behave like a subordinate. Pei Qian put his hand on his shoulder and asked him to be a little patient for the sake of the common cause. He asked the young man to report anything suspicious. As soon as Pei Qian put his hand on the young man's shoulder, he immediately jerked as if he had been electrocuted. This was strange to him. Pei Qian couldn't let anyone know about his secrets. Then under Ma Yan, they would stop talking, and it would be harder to extract information. Ma Yan told the boss that all the employees in the company were interested in Sunstrike Game Studio, and asked how famous they were. Pei Qian spread his hands and said that he couldn't answer this question. He was really only interested in how to spend the money. Given that their group would show up at Sunstrike's office, Pei Qian asked a friend to make inquiries about the developers. Ma Yan immediately caught the hint and smirked. The boss could easily lose his image by asking a couple stupid questions, and he agreed to help him out. The next morning, the Tengda representatives went on a tour. Their way lay among huge office skyscrapers. The Sunstrike building looked inconspicuous against this background. It had no more than 20 floors. Yet they owned the whole building. One of the guys said Sunstrike once paid 5 months' salary to its employees as a bonus. The twin girls from the reception couldn't stay away, and with satisfied faces took selfies against the city scenery. Pei Qian followed behind his assistant Hai Liu. He estimated that it cost the owner a lot of money to build such a building. A young man stood at the granite column at the entrance. He said that he was welcoming important guests and introduced himself. His name is Sun Si. The young man smiled and said he would be their guide today. Sun Si asked him to excuse his lack of hospitality. They shook hands firmly, and Pei Qian said that there was nothing wrong with it. The twins looked at the young man with interest. Song Shi smiled and motioned for them to follow him. Pei Qian and her assistant followed him, while the others admired the company's capabilities. The receptionist desk at Sunstrike was carved from a solid piece of white marble. Joe leaned on it and waited for the guests. He fixed his hair, which he'd done for this meeting, and thought it was about time the guests arrived. Mu Yan's calculations were correct. A moment later, a series of footsteps sounded in the lobby, and several people appeared at the counter. Sun Shi walked over to his boss and reported the arrival of the president of Tengda Company and all his staff. Joe was a little surprised by this. The men smiled at each other and shook hands. Each expressed his appreciation to the other company president. Joe only now discerned that his guest's suit cost a couple tens of thousands, and thought that President Qian was a wealthy heir. Sun Shi smiled politely and started the tour of Sunstrike's office. He asked the honored guests to follow him. The first thing the young man did was to show the guests the recording studio for creating sound effects and voiceovers for game characters. It turned out that the company had its own lecture hall, where classes on game development were held. It was designed for 36 people. Sun Shi showed off items of his own making with company logos. Among them was a cosplay costume advertising their game. Lastly, the young man led the visitors into a small room and proudly told them that this was their lounge area. They could help themselves to snacks at any time. Juan Sibo almost laughed. He thought it was very strange that a room with only a television and a console was called a lounge area. The young man looked with the same disdain at the sofa, which was designed for 3 people, and the small round table beside it. Barely glancing at the rack of food for the guests, Sibo criticized for himself their small assortment. Meanwhile, the rest of the delegation came up. They could not believe their eyes. The vacation conditions were terrible in a reputable company. President Zhou turned purple with anger. He had tried so hard for the guests, but their faces were cold, and no one even moved. Mu Yan mentally shouted that he even had a sofa and a TV in his lounge area to top it off. Not every company could boast such comfort. He wasn't much of a telepath, and the Tengda staff remained silent. There was a long pause. Ma Yan was the first to react. He remembered that he had to ask various questions to the company representatives in such a case. The young man decided to immediately test his communication skills and wondered what would be the best thing to ask Zhou. Ma Yan smiled and asked President Zhou as if nothing had happened, asking why so many employees were in the office on Saturday. Mu Yan looked at his interlocutor dumbfounded. He was sure that the whole country worked 12 hours 6 days a week. Unfortunately, Songxi didn't understand what Ma Yan was implying. He was pondering the same thing as the company president. Juan Sibo effortlessly picked up the baton and exclaimed that the employees are all in place because they enjoy working overtime. Ma Yang said the company could go bankrupt if it paid so many employees for overworked hours. Cho began to understand little by little and boiled up. This guy's money seems to be okay, paying for a Saturday as if it were overtime. President Zhou and Song Si looked at each other in silence. Their eyes clearly read the mute question of how someone could work with extra overtime pay. Pei Qian realized that things had gone too far and grabbed Ma Yan by the elbow. He asked him to stop asking questions. Meanwhile, Juan Sibo tried to soften the situation and smiled at the owners. He asked them to forgive their new employee for his insolence. Sun Chi smiled back and offered to continue the tour. Their company scheduled a meeting to share their experiences. They entered a large office hall where quite a few workstations were located. Some of them had employees working at them. The delegation walked down the narrow passage between the workstations, and Pei Qian tried to take note of everything. The others were also looking at the foreign office. Shilo quietly whispered to Huang Shibo that it must be too crowded here, and they were not feeling well. Huang Shibo smiled and said that it was fine. He knew that it could be even tighter, and Pei Qian was just being generous with a comfortable seat in the office. Zhou was alert and heard every word. He was willing to argue about the cramped quarters, because these were the working conditions in every office. The meeting hall was completely filled. A man from the podium asked Juan Sibo to share his experience of creating the Ghost General game. Mu Yanzhou and Lin Wan sat in the front row. They clapped their hands loudly, followed by everyone else in the hall. On the side where President Pei Qian and his assistant and the rest of the team was sitting, there was a round of applause. Juan Sibo was embarrassed and explained that he had not been involved in the creation of the game, but he could talk about the reasons for its success. The first reason, the young man said, was the desire for perfection. The drawings alone took half of the game's budget, and a special person was hired for this purpose. In addition, Peikin was cautious about in-game purchases and only made the price 41. After that, the ratings skyrocketed upwards. Linwan felt this conference was a chance for a new life, and so she avidly wrote down every word without missing a sound. Sibo said that Pei Chen put all his savings into the development of the game. It was promoted through microblogging, and soon became famous among creative people. Peikin was very pleased with his designer for his feedback. He had never imagined that it would turn out so well. Huang Shibo watched his boss carefully and noticed that Qian faintly nodded. The young man was glad that he was beginning to understand his leader. The man thanked Sibo for speaking and gave the floor to President Zhou, who promised to speak about his accomplishments. Stepping onto the podium, Zhou turned around and looked at Pei Qian. He had pulled off a risky endeavor, leaving no money for advertising and hiring an aspiring artist. Pei Qian seemed as if he didn't notice his gaze and applauded like everyone else. Zhou thought that this man was quite young, but he was already strong inside. Mu Yang revealed that his team is currently working on a new shooter called Puncture, and they want to surpass the famous team-based shooter. Zhou said most shooter players are old-school gamers, and they care more about the feel of the game than anything else. The team did a lot of work on the textures. They even hired a military expert to work on the weapon models. When he heard that Zhou had decided to make the game free, but the player pays for the equipment, Huang Sibo turned pale. He realized that the project would fail. The young man was only now noticing that the two companies' games were completely different, and older players would be more likely to pay attention to Cork. Huang Sibo began to analyze the situation in case both games would enter the market and win universal acclaim. He looked at his boss's reaction and suddenly found Pei Chen smiling, as if nothing had happened, and he was not worried about the fate of the fortress. Huang Sibo was beginning to guess that Pei Qian had brought them here to learn Sunstrike's course, and now he could see that the Cork was a failed project. Pei Qian applauded the hardest. He saw that Zhou was going in the right direction, and soon the ocean fortress was going to be buried. Pei Qian shook the speaker's hand and said that he had an excellent speech, something to learn from. Zhou replied that he himself envied Qian because of his talents. He apologized and referred to the fact that he had to leave urgently on business. Pei Qian nodded understandingly and said goodbye. Zhou turned around and walked away at the same second. Pei Qian watched him for a moment and slowly walked in the other direction. Linwan was among the last to leave the meeting room and noticed Pei Qian leaving. She looked back at the young man with mixed feelings. Making up her mind, the girl ran after the guest and called out to him. The surprised Pei Qian stopped. He hadn't seen this girl before. Linwan introduced herself and asked if the president of Tengda Company had a moment. She would like to ask a few questions. Pei Qian smiled. This girl with fiery red hair was simply adorable, and he couldn't refuse her. Linwan asked where his company stood in the young man's life and whether making money was his main goal. The young man was embarrassed and said that the main purpose of making games is to make people happy. Wan Lin smiled and assumed that in that case, no one in the Tengda Company was getting fired. Pei Qian stated that all employees are one big family. They grow and improve together. A little embarrassed, Wan leaned closer to the young man and asked if his employees were working overtime. Pei Qian replied that he tries to send everyone home, but some stay voluntarily and he pays them extra for their work. The girl suggested that Pei Qian creates games to fulfill his dreams. The young man objected that he was working for money. Linwan blushed and said that Pei Qian was trying to make her laugh. If money was needed, there would be a significant budget allocated to the Ghost General. The girl bowed politely and thanked Pei Qian for his time and answering her questions. In the same instant, Linwan turned around and left, and Pei Qian stared after the fiery red hair for a while longer. If Pei Qian could see Linwan's face, he would notice that the girl was satisfied with her interview and smiling happily. President Qian scratched his head in puzzlement. He didn't know who this girl was and what to expect from her. On the same day, the guests went home after the event. Linwan came to Boss Zhou's house with a resignation letter. The president was a little busy and didn't immediately realize why she had come. But then he realized his head in surprise and asked what was wrong. Wan held an envelope with an official non-cooperation form in her hand and said firmly that she had decided to quit. Zhou was triumphant. He decided that Linwan had finally seen the darkness of the game industry and decided to inherit his multi-billion-dollar fortune. The president pulled his hand for a statement and lazily inquired if the girl had decided to leave the entertainment industry for good. Looking her former boss in the eye, Linwan explained that she had no intention of leaving the game industry scene at all. A smirk froze on Zhou's face. He didn't understand why he would quit his job without leaving the gaming industry. Joe politely asked the girl if there were any work-related reasons. He still believed that he was providing the employees with decent conditions. Lin Wan smiled and thanked Joe for his concern. She thought about it and looked at the ajar window, from which she could smell freedom. The girl said that in this company she just can't fulfill her dream, so she can't stay any longer. Lin Wan went to the window and saw a pigeon sitting on a branch right above it. She thought it was a good sign. Near the Shenhua office buildings, there were many white pigeons on the sidewalk. Just recently, someone had scattered crumbs and they had flown down to feast. It was January of the year 2010. The weather outside was quite warm and the leaves on the trees had not yet fallen. Pei Qian walked out of his office and looked around the team in a businesslike manner. Everyone was sitting in their seats and working hard on the game. He approached Juan Sibo and asked how work on the Ocean Fortress was progressing and if its release needed to be delayed. The designer exclaimed that everything was perfectly fine. His team checked everything several times and fixed the bugs. The game could be released. Pei Qian's legs began to shake. He didn't like this kind of confidence from the designer. Qian asked to be shown the epic weapon. Juan Sibo's fingers ran eagerly over the keyboard. The designer assured that he would show both weapons and the game's plot. Sibo showed off a story mode designed for 6 hours of playtime. The graphics were quite simple. The epic weapon called Rainbow Red Dragon could be purchased for 888 won. Pei Qian was surprised to notice that the game's graphics were different from the expected level. And even compared to other shooters, it looked good. President Chen turned green with anger, mentally cursing the designer for creating such a beautiful game. Suddenly, he remembered everything and turned pale. It turned out that if anyone was to blame for the success of the game, it was himself. That day, he wanted to spend the system money faster, and out of greed, allowed the game's budget to double. The designers purchased models with detailed renderings. Nevertheless, the game has successfully implemented a story mode that allows you to spend more time in the game. Epic weapons have also been added. Juan Sibo couldn't know what the boss was thinking. He said that the game implemented a few more game modes and offered to show. Pei Qian waved his hand in a friendly manner and said that it was fine. You can send the game to the official website for verification. The president was leaving satisfied. In any case, the cork should be out soon, and the game won't stand up to stiff competition. Pei Qian walked into his office and sat down at his workstation. The first thing to do was to check the status of his system accounts. The situation had changed a little. He had managed to spend some money. Everything will be finally known in 19 days. Pei Qian leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. He was very tired, having spent 2 whole months unsuccessfully trying to spend all the money. The young man thought it would be pretty nice to have another event and spend the last 100,000. He called out to his faithful assistant Shin. The girl didn't come immediately and ran into the office, slightly out of breath. Pei Qian asked Hai Liu to organize an event to celebrate the completion of the game and to book seats if possible. The girl finished making notes in her notebook and was surprised to be reminded that tomorrow was still a working day, Friday. Pei Qian explained that it would be unfair to deprive employees of a day off and spend it on a work event. Hai Liu asked if he remembered that girl Lin Wan from Sunstrike Company who asked a lot of questions. Of course, he immediately remembered her. It turned out that Wan had come to the city to work for their company and was willing to work even for free. Pei Qian froze in surprise. He asked Hai Liu about her own opinion of the girl. Few people agree to work for free. The assistant replied that Lin Wan might be much more complicated than she seems. Apparently, she is innocent and comes from a wealthy family. Pei Qian was pleased in his heart. She might not be good at anything, but this was the kind of employee he valued for gold. The president agreed to hire Lin Wan at a salary of 4,000 and asked that the girl be included in the list of employees for the event. Lin Wan sat in the small guest room on a comfortable sofa with blue and yellow colored cushions. The girl drank her tea thoughtfully and pondered whether she would succeed in getting a position in such a fine company. Suddenly, the door of the president's office opened, and Hai Liu's assistant walked out to the girl. Lin Wan froze in the anticipation. Ms. Shin smiled at her and showed her the contract. She asked Lin Wan if a salary of 4,000 yen would suit her. The girl looked so happy that she didn't need to be asked. Her eyes were radiant with joy. Lin Wan asked Hai Liu what her job description would be. The girl hesitated. This was something they hadn't discussed. She smiled and asked to attend an event where they would watch a movie and sing karaoke. Lin Wan smiled embarrassedly. She still couldn't believe her luck. She had managed to get a job in an office that one could only dream of. Monday came, and the staff went about their duties. The girls at the reception desk chatted cheerfully with each other. Huang Xibo came into the office and noticed that Bao Shu wasn't doing anything, but just sitting on a chair and staring dejectedly at the screen. Xibo asked his partner if he had paid attention to the traffic on their Ocean Fortress game. Shu raised his head and sighed heavily. He said that the game was tested pretty quickly, and it was already released on Saturday. However, downloads are yet to be seen. Huang Xibo suggested that the boss wasn't even trying to promote the game. He searched the internet himself and found no mention of it. Bao Shu replied that the boss should be trusted, and if he didn't ask to advertise the game, he has some reason to do so. Huang Xibo realized that it was pointless to continue the conversation any further and swung his legs off the stool. He recognized that his interlocutor was right. Huang Xibo said that there was no need to doubt someone as intelligent and honorable as Qian. Shu looked at the young man gratefully. Xibo suggested to start developing a new version of the game. Bao Shu questioned the young man in surprise. He thought it was a joke. Huang Xibo said their team is still idle, waiting for new tasks and people have nothing to occupy themselves with. Bao Hu said that it wasn't a bad idea, and they could start preparing to redesign the game. He asked Xibo where they would start. That's exactly what the problem was. The game just came out and no one reported any problems with the game. There was nothing to add either. In their Sea Fortress game, the player could choose any of the 5 available game modes, and that was quite enough. Huang Xibo suggested giving the game to old-school players to test and start working based on their authoritative opinion. Bao Yu was confused and asked where he could find such people, especially since they would also need to pay for testing. That was exactly what Huang Xibo hadn't thought of. He scratched his head and said that he would have to think of something else. Xibo started looking for the right people on gaming forums, but no one wanted to work for free, so he had a new idea. The young man created an intra-company developer group to socialize and offered to participate in testing the game. Unfortunately, none of the thousands of developers wanted to do business with him, or were in another gaming group. Charlu suggested finding some groups playing team shooters, infiltrating them, and secretly contacting the leader. Huang Xibo laughed and said that this is a very bad idea. They would be cursed for publicizing a third-party project. The young man scratched his head sadly. They really could not only be cursed, but also suspended from the game. Huang Xibo sighed sadly and leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes, but nothing came to mind. Lin Wan unexpectedly came to the rescue. She said that she knew a couple of leaders of large 1,000-member teams, and they were involved in shooters. Huang Xibo blossomed with happiness and asked if Wan could help. The girl smiled and replied that they knew each other well. Xibo scratched his head and thoughtfully wondered how Lin Wan knew them. From the looks of it, she didn't look like a fierce player. Lin Wan explained that during her internship, players were hired to test out the punchline, and she was the group's administrator. A new high-rise building was built on the other side of town. Housing in it was not cheap, given the prestige of the neighborhood. In one of the apartments of an elite building, there was a young man from the testing group. He earned enough to afford a good computer. Their team was called the Tigers, and the young man wore the insignia proudly. A new notification appeared in the corner of the screen. One of his acquaintances, Lin Wan, asked to test the game, and Chen reminded her that his team had completed all the necessary tests. The girl informed her that it was a completely different game. In addition, she informed her friend that she had quit Sunstrike. Chen smirked and said that she left just in time before all the staff received a solid bonus for releasing the game. Lin Wan bragged that she now works for a company that is 100 times better than Sunstrike and reminded her that she was asking to test the game. The young man agreed and clarified the price. He assumed that he would be paid the same price as last time, 500 won. Lin Wan smiled and said she wouldn't give any money, but she could offer a limited edition Desert Eagle pistol. Chen was indignant that her new company was so greedy that they didn't want to pay for testing. The girl assured him that there was a lot of money at stake. The girl's gaze fell on the gun screen. After a little thought, Van offered to give the epic weapon from their new game along with the gun. Chen opened himself a Coke and squealed that no one was interested in game weapons, especially since they are inexpensive and cost a couple hundred yuan at most. Lin Wan looked confused. She reported that that epic weapon was actually worth 888 yuan. Chen choked up in surprise and splashed brown carbonated liquid all over the monitor. He asked again how much money he was talking about. Chen instantly rushed to get a rag and hurriedly began to wipe the monitor. After finishing the rest of the Coke, he calmed down a bit. The young man asked what currency he was referring to. Lin Wan replied that she immediately wrote to him. She meant nearly 900 yuan. Chen couldn't believe it. He grabbed the monitor as if he was trying to shake the girl herself and shouted that no fool would buy such a weapon. After a while, the young man agreed and Linwan dropped a link to the game on the Steam digital store. The page offered to play the game for free. Chen loaded the game while eating breakfast on the go. He didn't like the name very much, and because of that, there was a bias towards the game. However, after launching the game, the young man changed his opinion and admitted that the graphical effects looked pretty good. Chen opened the weapons store and found the very epic weapon the girl was talking about. He carefully looked at all of its characteristics. However, the young man didn't like the fact that there were no other items in the in-game store. And the properties of the fire dragon didn't make it stand out among other weapons. But Chen was pleased with the variety of game modes. For example, he heard about the biochemical mode for the first time in his life. The young man reached for the sausage and his fork stopped halfway through. Chen was surprised that there was even a story mode implemented here. His eyes were running wild. Everything was interesting to try. Chen couldn't decide what to test first. Since there were no special hopes for this game, the guy decided to try the story mode first and see what was realized. Having made a final decision in favor of the story, Chen selected the appropriate menu item and clicked the mouse. The game loading indicator appeared on the screen. It was realized in the form of a white bar filled with green color. Immediately after loading, the screen became black. And the young man already thought that the game froze or something else happened. Turns out, it was meant to be. The hero's eyes began to open. Through the murky fog, he recognized two men in chemical defense suits. One of them said that the boy was already infected with G infection and would die anyway. The second staff member suggested not to touch the young man. After a while, his sight fully returned to the young man, but his enemies had already disappeared somewhere in the meantime. He began to look around, and it appeared that he was in a pyramid of human bodies. The young man managed to put his hand between the bodies. He began to climb out, gasping at the smell of decay. At last, he found himself on the top of the mountain and decided to catch his breath. The guy had to go downstairs and he looked around. Having apologized in advance to the dead, the hero of the game ran downstairs. He stepped on one man's back right into a pool of blood and pushed himself off his body with a shriek. The descent was quite steep. The young man fell to the floor, unable to hold on. At the last moment, he managed to put his elbows up and saved his face. With oohs and groans, the exasperated young man stood up. He had just begun his escape, and already his whole body ached, and there was no telling what lay ahead. Apparently, he was now in some half-abandoned warehouse. A tutorial menu on how to operate the game appeared on the screen. Young admitted that the game is actually a lot better than it looks, and there is even training for beginners. Holding his hand to the bruised spot on his stomach, Chen waddled to the door and grabbed the handle. He hoped the final boss wasn't waiting for him there. The young man pressed the handle of the door and began to turn it slowly. The atmosphere here did not inspire confidence. As soon as the door opened, a skeleton in a mercenary's uniform appeared on the threshold. On his shoulder hung a shoulder harness with a shiny pistol. The young man screamed in fright. This mercenary monster seemed real, and he didn't have any weapons with him. The zombie placed a bony hand on the young man's shoulder and opened its mouth. It appeared to have a full jaw with incisors. And Chen shrieked in a low voice. The mercenary pulled the young man to him and sank his fangs greedily into his meaty shoulder. Chen could have sworn it was real. The hero on the screen screamed in unbearable pain. At some point, he decided that he could not resist the monster. Despite the fact that his whole body was wobbling with fatigue, the young man managed to stand up. He grabbed the mercenary by the throat with all his might. With his free hand, Chen reached for the holster and deftly snatched the pistol. It was quite heavy and looked real. The young man pulled the mercenary closer to him by the throat and promised to send him to the next life. The skeleton's skull was already shattered, worms swarming in it. Chen took the gun off the safety and shot him directly in the forehead. The mercenary once again left the world of the living and fell to the floor. The young man's legs were shaken after all this. It wasn't like a shooter. It was a good horror game. Cheng's strength gave up. His legs gave out, and the young man fell to his knees. He assumed that the zombie bite had infected his body. Even so, it was hard for the guy to hold his body weight. His strength left him, and Chen collapsed on his side, thinking that this was the end. His eyelids were getting heavier by the second. At the moment when Chen was about to give up, he suddenly saw the thin legs and gray shoes in front of him. A little girl of about 8 in gray tattered clothes leaned over the young man, holding a vaccinator in her hand. She clenched her other hand into a fist. The girl was not quite ordinary. Through the transparent casing, it was visible that the vaccinator was filling with green blood. It was causing her unbearable pain. The little girl began to inject the young man with her blood. Chen was relieved, and realized that the girl's blood was curing him of the virus. Chen squatted down and raised his 5 fingers upward, trying to speak to the girl. Unfortunately, she didn't understand the greeting in any language. The little girl looked at him with sadness in her eyes and started gesturing. Chen realized that the little girl could not speak. She was mute. Chen in the real world frowned at the screen with completely different eyes. This game was completely different from the others. His hero managed to get a 6-barrel machine gun. Chen shot a little and realized that this game was more stable and had almost no recoil. After taking a few mercenaries in the crosshairs, the young man realized that in this game, an accuracy is much better. Moreover, the controls in this game are quite nice. While Chen was shooting away the crowds of enemies coming out of every crevice, the girl wasted no time. She found a way into the ventilation shaft. Chen shockingly thought that the girl saves the whole game. Without her, the constant fighting and shooting would get boring very quickly. As you'd expect, the final boss soon showed up in the form of a giant insect with a terrifying monster face. Fortunately, Chen managed to save the girl before the monster collapsed the multi-ton brick wall. After running a decent distance away, the young man fired a grenade launcher. The monster was finished rather quickly, but the ammunition in the warehouse began to detonate, and Chen barely had time to get away. A huge nuclear mushroom shook the entire neighborhood. Good thing that by this time, the intrepid hero had managed to fly the helicopter to a safe distance, and he was not hit by the wave. Chen was rapidly flying higher and higher. The glow from the glow cast a bright light all over the cabin. Even at this height, nuclear ash hung in the air. The tired girl fell asleep almost immediately in the passenger seat of the helicopter, and Chen covered her back with his clothes in a fatherly manner. The young man managed to break through. A moment later, he was flying high in the sky, leaving the epicenter of death far below. Amazed by the game, Chen just sat there for a while, staring dumbly at the screen. Just half an hour ago, he had a completely different attitude towards the game. Recovering, he started typing quickly. This game really managed to hook the young man. The plot was simply amazing. Chen wrote to one of his fellow testers that he found a game called Ocean Fortress that simply cannot be described in words. It must be played. A few days later, Pei Qian returned to the office. He had an exam session, and the young man didn't even think about work for a week. He sighed heavily as he walked into the office. By the looks of it, the Ocean Fortress should have been finished by now. To the young man's surprise, none of the beautiful twins were behind the reception desk. It wasn't like them at all. President Pei Qian anxiously walked down the corridor, and no one met his path. He couldn't understand what was going on. Fortunately, all the office staff were in place. Juan Sibo sat at the monitor with a detached look and didn't even turn around. Xiaoliu was concentrating on chewing on the cookies from the bag. He didn't seem to be interested in anything else. His loyal assistant, Xin Hailiu, along with Lin Wan, were standing with their backs to him and talking about something. The young man wrote it all off to the game's unfortunate output. Even Bao Shu wasn't playing at the computer, but stood by the wall and glumly contemplated a vase with a plant. Pei Qian thought that he was thinking about the meaning of existence. The young man warmly thought that his team deserved a rest. All those lazy people had given a lot of effort to his unprofitable game. He was determined that he needed to help them get out of such a state and calm them down. It is not for nothing that Qin is the president of the company. Both female employees heard a noise behind them and simultaneously turned around in bewilderment. As soon as they recognized the young man, their faces lit up with joy. Lin Wan almost threw herself into his arms out of happiness. The girl exclaimed with undisguised delight that Boss Pei had returned. At the same minute, the whole office came to life. The entire gloomy staff cheered the return of the boss. People were waving at him from all sides. The entire development team huddled together. They were all smiling and applauding the boss. Xiaoliu was even jumping up and down with joy. Pei Qian was stunned. He didn't understand why everyone was so gray and frowning just now, but now they were happy to see him. Huang Xibo stood up from his seat and walked toward the boss. His face looked very serious, and Pei Qian became wary. The young man looked straight into the president's eyes and walked forward. Huang Xibo stopped 2 steps away from the boss and looked at him. The young man bowed to Pei Qian and said that he had learned a lot from him. And now Xibo understands why the boss didn't want to advertise Ocean Fortress. After all, a good game needs only good feedback from players. Only then it will become popular. Pei Qian froze. Huang Xibo had struck a crushing blow, but the boss still hoped that he didn't mean the staggering success of the game. President Pei Qian tried his best to hide that he was nervous. With a trembling voice, he asked if Xibo was referring to the popularity of the Sea Fortress. Juan Sibo happily exclaimed that the game has become very popular lately, and he is now updating the playground. What's more, in terms of player numbers and revenue, they have overtaken Cork's competitors and left them far behind. A radiant Hailu walked up to them and handed the boss a bottle of high-end champagne in honor of their successful release. President Pei Chen didn't think for long. He smirked and immediately shook the bottle to everyone's satisfaction. The cork flew with a loud pop to the back of the office, and the champagne flowed in a river of applause. As if out of nowhere, the twins appeared. With a joyful gleam in their eyes, they simultaneously launched a streamer of large cardboard tubes. The president walked down the lively corridor with a bottle in his hand. The staff applauded their boss with undisguised joy. Peiken walked over to Huang Sibo with a smile on his face and handed him the bottle, thanking the entire team for a job well done. As soon as the young man took the champagne in his hands, the president turned in the opposite direction and walked out of the office with a confident stride. With a full-mouthed smile, Juan Sibo raised the bottle above his head, showing the others. He thought the boss had it under control. Juan didn't see that his boss's legs were shaking. He decided that his boss had anticipated the result and was therefore not surprised. Meanwhile, Pei Chen barely made it to his office. Pushing down on the door handle with all his might, he stepped inside and closed the door. The young man slid exhaustedly to the floor, propping his back against the door. He couldn't understand what had happened to the game and where he had strayed from the path. This simply could not happen, because he deliberately chose losing business development strategies. His whole body was shaking. Pei Chen couldn't even stand on his feet and moved around the office holding on to pieces of furniture. At last the young man managed to reach the chair, and he sank blissfully into it, closing his eyes. It was hard to understand how this could have happened. Pei Kin unfolded the laptop and thought that this time, there was no Ruin Guanjian advertising his game. A young man went to the Ocean Fortress game page in the digital store. His eyes widened in surprise. There were a lot of comments on the page about the game. Almost all of them were positive. Many people gave the maximum rating. Pei Tian leaned back in his chair tiredly. A lot of people were praising his product and imposing their evaluation on others. A salutary thought occurred to the young man. He decided to ask Juan Sibo to find out why their product was so popular. Sholiu worriedly told Huang Sibo that the atmosphere between the players on the forums was getting heated. Sibo happily pointed out that it was a credit to the boss. Just then, a new notification appeared on the screen. Both of them read it again, but it still seemed incomprehensible. Peiken demanded to analyze the success of Ocean Fortress in terms of design and marketing policy and send him a report. Juan Sibo was in a great mood. It was strange that the boss needed to analyze the game. After all, not advancing the game was his decision. The natural conclusion was that President Pei wanted the staff to scrutinize the project and expected them to strive for excellence. The network printer in the president's office buzzed, and the young man grudgingly glanced at the crawling sheet of paper. Apparently, Juan Sibo did everything promptly and sent a report on the marketing success of the game. I should have thought it over carefully. To this end, Pei Kin called another meeting in his head. All of his clones held a copy of the game report in their hands. The student reported that many players started playing because of the lower difficulty and also because of the introduction of the story mode. Sipping some hot drink, Peikin noticed that there were several battle modes in the game, and this attracted players. Another Peikin said that the high price for epic weapons satisfies the big players. At the same time, ordinary weapons are not inferior to it. Chairman Peikin banged his gavel with anger and shouted that he didn't understand the game's increase in popularity compared to punching. Peiche with a red bow tie spread his hands and said, smiling, it was unclear who was to blame this time. The student reported that Huang Sibo and Bao Shu created the game based on the requirements and budget provided. Lin Wan only asked people she knew to test the game. Pei Chen with a gamepad in hand said that they released the game on the same day as Breakdown. All 5 clones flatly refused to take the blame for the unexpected success of an obviously failed product. The meeting was over. Nothing was clear. Pei Chen slapped the table in his office with both palms in his heart. The president was furious. He had been outplayed again. The young man tried to pull himself together. He told himself that he would find a way out. Rising to his full height from his last strength, Pei Chen thundered his fist at someone invisible and promised himself that he would get his money from the system this time. The next day, all the staff returned to their duties. The twins at the reception desk smiled politely at visitors. Pei Chen called up the system menu and estimated that there was still quite a lot of money. The only thing that made him happy was that the Ghost General had stopped generating income. On the other hand, Ocean Fortress's popularity started to gain momentum. In 1 week alone, he earned 400,000. Hailu came in with a report and said that the bandwidth of the game servers had been increased. The company has signed a contract with them. Pei-tian perked up and thanked the girl for a job well done. This was just what he needed. The president figured he would earn 600,000 by the time the system account was transformed, and only 6 of them would come into his personal account. The only way he could make money was to have less than the 500,000 yuan required by the system. But there was a flaw in this as well. After all, even earning 100 yuan a day, Pei-tian would only receive 1 of them. Therefore, only the loss from the business became the real earnings. Things were getting complicated. Initially, it was necessary to lose 500,000, but now this amount turned into 600,000. Pei-tian asked Hailu's assistant if she had increased the salary of all staff members. The girl nodded and smiled faintly. She said proudly that she had already done everything according to his instructions. The department heads have had their salaries increased by 60%, and everyone else will receive 30% more starting today. In addition, they will introduce a bonus for a successful game product. Each of the developers involved will receive 15% of the game's revenue. In addition, at the end of each month, the company's management will reward all employees with gift certificates worth 1,000 yuan. Pei-tian sighed. This was better than nothing. This way he would be able to spend another 300,000 yuan. The system wouldn't give any more. Hailu opened her notebook and reminded her boss that the employees were getting their paychecks today. The girl asked if he wanted to add anything else. At the thought of salaries and benefits, another saving thought occurred to the director. He came up with another expense item. Pei-tian smiled and exclaimed that he had decided to pay each employee 3,500 every 3 months for office supplies. This seemed very strange to Hailu. She wondered why she was being so generous. The employees were already getting all the allowances they could get. Pei-tian stated that this is a special payment applied to purchase things for work. For example, Bao Shu can spend this amount to buy games or equipment. The girl was still hesitant, and the president added that some employees needed special gaming headphones with quality sound. Hailu smirked and pretended to believe him. She wrote down the new demand and promised to fulfill it. Meanwhile, work was in full swing at the central office. Everyone was in high spirits due to the success of the game. Huan Sibo was so happy he was even humming a song to himself. The popularity of their game simply eclipsed the competitor's shooter, Purboin. The young man smiled. He had recently become more aware of his boss and realized that Pei-tian had foreseen the success of their game back on that business trip. It is for this reason that he purposely released his game on the day of the release of Pitchfork and to take some of the glory for himself. Huan Sibo was almost crying with joy. He was very happy that his boss had defeated the arrogant competitors. The young man continued to work, still happy for the success of the president and the company. Several notifications came to his phone. Barely picking up the phone, Huan Sibo was very surprised. All 3 notifications were from the bank. And he realized that his paycheck had arrived. This time it was no less strange. My salary had been raised again, and the payout was very substantial. I had never dreamed of such a thing before. Judging from the notice, the young man's salary was raised by another 1,500 yuan, and he just couldn't believe it. There were cheers from all sides. One of the employees couldn't believe that he was getting so much. The other one got a 10,000 increase in his salary. Hailu, the personal assistant to the president of the company, walked into the office and clapped her hands together, calling everyone to silence. She said that every month, employees will receive a gift certificate of 1,000 yuan to buy necessary items. The twins at the front desk stood with their backs to each other and handed out golden certificates to everyone with a smile. Everyone was happy. Hailu added that employees will receive 3,500 every 3 months for needs related to their work activities. Huang Sibo and Celia were just looking at the certificates. When they heard that there would be more payments, they were stunned with surprise. Bao Hu was happy that he could now play games and not spend a penny on them, since they were his earnings. Sha-Liu said thoughtfully that the boss pays them too generously. They have a decent salary and a lot of allowances, and now this kind of payment. To top it all off, Hailu reported that everyone is working until 3 o'clock today, and then they are celebrating the success of Ocean Fortress at the mall. After work, Pei-tian gathered all the employees and took them to an upscale shopping center. The top floor was already reserved. All the employees were climbing the stairs of the shopping center and looking at the magnificent interior with delight. Many were here for the first time. Turns out, that wasn't all. The president said that today, they were celebrating the success of their brainchild, so he was paying for everyone to go shopping. Pei-tian calculated that after all the payments, there were about 400,000 yuan left in the system account, and more needed to be spent. He demanded that all employees spend 1,000 yen each from the card and 3,500 special payments. Tycoon stated that the money must be spent in full or they would not get any money. He turned around and suggested that they get down to business. All the employees were very satisfied. With joyful shouts, they scurried around the shopping center looking for the right products. The twins immediately ran to one of the boutiques. One of the young men volunteered to accompany Juan Sibo and went with him. The girls stopped in the luxury perfume department and looked at the goods on the shelves with interest. Juan Sibo had already managed to find himself some headphones and was looking around enthusiastically. Pei Chen thought he would let them spend all the money. He could buy something for himself at the same time. The young man thought dreamily that he would allocate 100,000 yen for it. The system seemed to be fine with it, and Pei Chen decided that he would spend everything. He hoped that he would incur a loss because of the purchases. The young people had time to visit a clothing store and tried on sweaters and jackets. The clothes were quite stylish. Then they wrapped up in the computer peripherals department and stared at the handheld console for a long time, agreeing that it was a bargain. Hailu carefully painted scarlet lipstick on one of the confused twins and said that this shade would suit all occasions. Baogu bought himself the latest model of mechanical keyboard. Especially today, it came with a mouse pad as a gift. Tycoon's employees were also in the elite cell phone department, and he furtively watched them. At this time, Linwan was nearby. She noticed the boss's unusual behavior. She found it very strange. Tycoon was very angry. Far from all the employees wanted to spend their money now, and it was necessary to force them. Charlotte was happily trying out a phone worth almost 4,000 yen. It was not a bad piece of equipment, but the price was a bit steep. Suddenly, Pei's boss appeared in the selfie camera. He told the puzzled employee that you could buy the phone if you liked it. Shou Liu embarrassedly replied that his phone should last another couple of years, and this new phone is very expensive. Tycoon said he could use the special payment for this if he couldn't afford to buy a phone. Shou raised his head in surprise and objected that the special payment had nothing to do with his work. Tycoon resented and said that the young man will still test new mobile games. That's exactly what the new phone is for. Shou was still hesitant. A trickle of sweat ran down his face from the tension. He didn't want to spend so much money on a phone. Tycoon couldn't stand it and shouted that that phone was reducing his productivity, so he should buy a new one. Only now the young man agreed and happily took the box with the phone. He wanted to buy it himself, but could not make up his mind. Huang Sibo stood there, and Pei Chen glumly advised him to change his phone as well. Sibo said that he had only changed it 2 months ago. Tycoon insisted on changing the phone, and Huang Sibo said to avoid conflict, he would go look at the laptop. Tycoon then switched to Ma Yan looking at the headphones and reminded him that his headphones cost around 20 yuan at the time of purchase. Pei Chen picked up the latest model and said that they only cost 3,000 yuan. The young man replied that he didn't work with headphones. President Qian sighed heavily and looked at his loyal comrade with a serious look. The young man felt uncomfortable from his gaze. Tycoon took the headphones and forcefully placed them into Ma Yan's hands, making it clear that the young man could not refuse. The boss explained to the shocked employee that they needed to prepare ahead of time. They would be working a lot with sound in the future, and quality headphones would be essential. Ma Yan smiled and hesitantly tried to object that they already had decent branded headphones with a headset in their office. Pei Chen angrily said that this would sometimes need to be done after work as well, so it couldn't be done without headphones. After a while, he managed to convince the young man, and a happy Ma Yan ran to the cash register to pay for his purchase. Pei Chen smiled. Everything was going according to plan. Lin Wan had been watching him the entire time and was surprised to realize that the boss had gained nothing for himself. Tycoon seemed to sense the girl's presence and turned around perplexed. Their eyes met, and the young man felt out of place. Lin Wan laughed and showed the latest model of a top-of-the-line phone. She exclaimed that she had almost the entire range of this store. The young man tried to force a smile out of himself. It was a shame to admit it, but a rich heiress could do whatever she wanted with her money. Tycoon had left the electronics department and was now just wandering around the mall, looking at everything around him. He estimated that there was about 70,000 left in the system account, and he needed to spend it. Then, that amount would turn into his earnings. There was a jewelry boutique nearby, and Pei Chen wrapped up there, deciding that it was the perfect place to spend money. Lin Wan was not going to back down and continued to secretly follow the young man. She wondered what her boss was going to buy. The employees gathered at a predetermined location. They all had several bags with various purchases in their hands. Pei Chen leisurely approached them, and everyone involuntarily turned around and awed. He was wearing many new elite accessories. For a watch, a notebook, a stylish pen, and a belt buckle, The young man gave more than 70,000. Adding a little from his pocket, Linwan had her own measurements. And she thought with delight that the boss was very thrifty. He didn't even spend 100,000 on all his purchases. Huang Xibo held 2 shopping bags in his hand. He noted that all of these incredibly expensive items were related to work. Linwan said that the boss pays them all a generous salary and doesn't skimp on bonuses. Without collusion, they simultaneously exclaimed that Pei was an incredible boss. Meanwhile, Pei Qian himself was very disappointed. He bought everything the system allowed, but he only spent 3,000 yuan. Pei Qian approached the assistant and asked her to pick up a gift for his friend, who was about to become the boss. The girls began to make suggestions. Hailu suggested perfume. The twins suggested an expensive suit or watch. Unfortunately, none of this was right for the young man. He had already bought everything the system allowed. He sighed doomedly and bowed his head. Linwan suggested buying glasses. They will give a representative look, tell quite a lot about a person. This idea wasn't a bad one. Pei Qian asked where he could buy the most expensive glasses, and Hailu kindly offered to help. Soon, the two of them returned from the optical department. Pei Qian was satisfied. The glasses had cost him 16,000. Wan Li was now looking at her boss with loving eyes. The glasses looked very stylish. The girl realized that he had bought glasses for himself as well. Together with the points, it turned out that out of the 70,000, Pei Qian had only spent 20. He regretfully thought that it wasn't enough. He envisioned himself in an astronaut suit with a red flag on the surface of the moon, and told himself that this was a big step toward fighting the system. Pei Qian made himself some hot tea. The morning was starting off quite nicely. The wealth conversion system has begun to operate. The profit conversion rate is 100 to 1. The loss conversion rate is 1 to 1. The wealth transformation system began its calculations. The boy felt a wonderful sense of accomplishment from spending money. He decided to keep trying and see what the next goal was. The system gave him a special assignment for this week. The company needed to acquire a brick-and-mortar store located in a busy part of the city or near a university. It was a special assignment, and one he'd anticipated. After all, he knows the trends for the next 10 years. There's one word that describes brick-and-mortar stores. Pei Qian kept an eye on the numbers. He looked at the spreadsheet and thought about how rent would increase, which would also increase his expenses on physical stores. As more and more people enjoy staying at home, online shopping will grow rapidly. While the boy was thinking, there was a knock on his door and a package was delivered. The man asked him to sign for it. Pei Qian continued to think and plan. This could only happen in 10 years. Now the physical store will generate income, and it is necessary to draw up a plan. The boy smiled slightly and decided that he needed to deal with Huang Xibo and Bao Shu. He just happened to be near these guys and asked them to come over and take a look. Many were discussing their game. The Ocean Fortress began a new era with 888 yuan. He wondered if this was a blessing or a curse for the industry. One of the guys replied that he was aware of it and had been following everything closely. The other said, let them argue, as they had nothing to do with it. Boss Pei Qian's ideas are simply incredible. First, he used the breach to draw attention to the Ocean Fortress. And then the Fire Dragon, priced at 888 yuan, became popular. The boy added that, as he'd said, everything was going according to plan. Huang Xibo said he thought he was on the 5th floor, but he didn't realize the boss was already on the 100th. Bao Shu replied that of course, and there was no point in even trying to compete with him. Pei Qian asked to look in the group chat. He created a poll and explained that it would be anonymous. He wants everyone to vote for the person they consider the best worker. And then there will be a secret reward. The guys immediately cheered, clenching their fists in joy. The boy stood in the middle of the office, thinking about something. He heard footsteps behind him. He thought that as long as Huang Xibo and Bao Shu were with them, it would be difficult to lose money. If they stay, there will be a lot of problems. But he doesn't even have a reason to fire them. Linwan decided she needed to be kept under observation. The only reason she was able to contact players for testing was because of her work in Sunstrike. The secretary approached the boy and called him in. She explained that everyone had already voted. Pei Qian replied that he understood and began looking at his phone. He decided that this was to be expected. The boy opened the box that was brought to him, and inside was a golden statuette. Pei Qian took it out and congratulated one of the employees who won the vote. Everyone started clapping for him, happy for their comrade. The guys were shouting that he was very cool and were happy with this guy's results. Linwan was also happy and clapped her hands with the other staff members. They loudly congratulated the young man. Huang Xibo also thanked everyone for their support. When he held the golden statuette in his hands, Tears flowed from his eyes. He demonstratively wiped his eyes with his hands and said he wanted to thank his boss, Pei Qian, for her trust and help in growing. He was also grateful to everyone for their help and support. He is confident that the main factor in the success of the Ocean Fortress is the help and direction of boss Pei Qian. The second factor is brother Bao Shu's creative ideas. The boy laughed in response and looked a little embarrassed. Huang Xibo added that, of course, this is everyone's hard work and the result of their collective efforts. This isn't just his award, it's everyone's award. Lin Wan thought it was simply the perfect image of a company with morals. She knew that joining Tengdu was the right decision. Pei Qian spread his arms out to the sides and said that he knew what he would offer them now. He's about to present a special award to the best employee. Huang Xibo immediately looked at his boss with a frightened look. The boy told him that from that day on, he was no longer a member of the development team. The other guys were very surprised and cast questioning glances towards their boss. Huang Xibo grimaced in surprise, almost dropping his award. Pei Qian raised his hand to explain to the boys what he meant. The boy said that this position would be taken by Lu Ming Liang. He looked at the expressions on his employees' faces, trying to see if they understood him. Huang Xibo couldn't understand what this meant. Hadn't he received the Best Employee Award? What's going on? Did they fire him? The boss walked up to him and put his hand on his shoulder. He told the boy that he was still an employee of Tengda, but he would no longer work in the gaming department. Pei Qian explained that he decided to give him $1 million. He can choose any industry and invest $1 million in his dream. Whether he succeeds or not, the company will pay for everything. Huang Xibo was overjoyed that boss Pei hadn't fired him. He was surprised by such a large sum. Pei Qian adjusted his glasses and was pleased with his success. This was the best plan he could have come up with. Huang Xibo embraced his 2 awards and couldn't help but smile, so pleased. This was the first stage of destruction. Huang Xibo told his boss he wasn't sure he could handle it. It would be difficult for him to manage. But the boy came closer to him and, taking him by the shoulder, replied that he believed in him and he should believe in himself. Huang Xibo bowed before him and said, "Okay, he'll definitely try his best." Pei Qian was very pleased with this and decided it was simply a success. If you have a talent for developing games, you should stop developing them. If Huang Xibo leaves, game development will start to lose money. Pei Qian told him that he was as good as expected, and he'll lose $1 million too. Wouldn't that kill 2 birds with 1 stone? Pei Qian warned the boys that there would now be a reward for second place. He named one of Bao Shu's employees. He explained that although he was unfortunately second, the company did not forget his contribution. In honor of his second place, the company gives him a month's paid vacation. Starting tomorrow, he won't have to go to work and can travel and play. Bao Shu was simply shocked by this news. He thought about his boss telling him to travel and play, and what games. Didn't he live in an internet cafe? But the office is a little better than an internet cafe. But suddenly the boy clutched his head and told his boss he didn't need a vacation. He explained that he enjoyed his work. Pei Qian replied that he couldn't develop games while confined to 4 walls. If he wanted to be successful, he needed to expand his horizons. He asked if the young man understood. He'll ask his assistant, Shin, to draw up a travel plan for him. First, he'll visit and photograph all the country's landmarks. Then he'll study game development at the country's largest companies. The job requires it. Did he understand he couldn't refuse? Bao Shu immediately agreed with his boss. Pei Qian said, as he left, that the survey for the best employee title was over and everyone could return to their seats. The young man asked Ma Yan to come see him. The employee, a little alarmed, replied that of course he would. Pei Qian thought that by the time Bao Shu returned, the game would already be in development. Even if he had many creative ideas, they would already be useless. The boss was sitting in his office, and Ma Yan, an employee, was already standing next to him. He was quite constrained and cast a questioning glance at his boss. He told Brother Chen that even though he was his superior, he would be honest with him. He believed it was inappropriate to appoint Lu Ming Liang to Huang Xibo's position. He feels like he doesn't have the necessary skills. If he's become the chief planner, then he can do it too. The boss, pouring tea into 2 cups, asked the boy not to worry. He asked if Ma Yan thought he would treat him badly despite their relationship. The boy handed his employee a cup of tea and began to explain to him. He said, showing his hand, that he did not appoint him to such a high position because he had another important task for him. He decided to entrust him with the decisive step in Tengda's entry into new markets. And he asked if he was ready for it. The boy was very surprised by this proposal and asked if he was telling the truth. Then the boss handed him a phone and showed him something. There were a couple of spots in Jingzhou's business districts, and he wanted to choose the best one and open a chain of internet cafes. He wants to hand over all control to him and asked Ma Yan what he thought. Then the guy asked if he meant the owner of an internet cafe by the important position. The boss pointed his finger in front of him and exclaimed that this was not just an internet cafe. The boy tried to get through to his employee by explaining everything to him in a more accessible way. He said it would be a combination of an internet cafe, gaming experience, and hardware store. The equipment store will be equipped with everything necessary and of the highest quality, cinema, and other entertainment. This will be a large, incredible entertainment center. Tengda aims to grow into a large organization that will manage various industries across gaming, entertainment, hardware, and more. Therefore, this will be the main plan of their campaign. The boss grabbed the employee by the shoulder again and exclaimed that he couldn't entrust such a responsible task to anyone else. Therefore, he was relying entirely on him. Ma Yan didn't expect this from his boss and blushed, almost spilling his cup of tea. He brought the cup of tea to his lips and immediately tipped it back, drinking it in one gulp. Afterwards, he showed the bottom of the cup to his boss and asked him not to doubt him. He would definitely complete his task. Tycoon asked the guy to try harder if there weren't enough employees. Then he asked him to hire more people and not think about money. Ma Yan nudged his boss's arm and said that in that case, he'd go. Tycoon asked him to remember that a brick-and-mortar store wasn't their company's image. He shouldn't look cheap, and asked the guy if he understood that. Ma Yan looked at his boss with a serious expression and asked him not to worry. He asked to be given it and headed for the exit as quickly as possible. He left with great joy, closing the door. Ma Yan wanted to get out quickly to experience the full delight of his new position. Tycoon was also pleased, as he couldn't depend on anyone. After all, his brother was the most reliable person. The boy smiled at his own thoughts. He thought that the failure of the ocean fortress most likely occurred because he underestimated Huang Xibo and Bao Shu. Huang Xibo is now busy with another $1 million case. Bao Shu is going on vacation. Tycoon remained in his chair, very pleased with his plan, which he was slowly putting into action. He thought that Lu Ming Liang had taken over the management of game development, and Ma Yan was in charge of the internet cafe. Meanwhile, Huang Xibo was already becoming disoriented in his new position. He said it wasn't under his jurisdiction, told others that his boss wasn't there and they could come back another time. And he thought about how he'd lose $800,000 by the next payroll review. It was Wednesday, February 3rd. The day was bright and sunny. People were strolling the streets. In front of us is the company Tengda Network Technology ICO.Ltd meeting room. The company employees were too serious, and beads of sweat were running down their faces. The boys noticed that the atmosphere was too tense. Lu Ming Liang was the chief planner of the second generation of Tengda. The boy thought about how Brother Bao's paid vacation had started yesterday, and he hadn't seen Juan, so he no longer had any support. He was responsible for this project, and what if he couldn't handle it? The boss spread his arms and addressed his employees. He explained that he had an idea for a new game. This time, they'll create a game that will go down in history. The boy was very serious about his decision. He announced to his employees that this game was called Game Developer. Linwan wondered if their boss probably wanted to turn Tengda's story into a game and how they would do it. Tycoon began explaining that the game's premise was quite simple. Players would assume the role of a game developer. They would have to make decisions, and each choice would impact the ending. For example, a player can choose any game, payment methods, promotions, strategies, and so on. At the same time, the player will encounter a series of unexpected events. Players will create a game and be able to generate income and sell it. The outcome should look something like this. If there were any questions, he told his employees to ask them boldly. The boy realized, looking at his comrades, that they were in shock, and he hoped so. It's a niche genre. Not only is the content unappealing, but the gameplay is simple. It's a complete failure. Suddenly, one of the employees raised his hand and addressed the boss. He asked what form the game's narrative should take. What about an interactive story? There was a computer in front of us, and we had a choice whether it was true or not. Tycoon replied that it wasn't. Everything had to be in 3D and created using the most advanced 3D technology. Everything had to be at its best, both the characters and the plot. How much money can they spend on an interactive story? All they need is a couple of original drawings. If they find famous voice actors, they could spend a couple $100,000 yuan. Meanwhile, one of the employees was very surprised by such an announcement and also an interactive story. Tycoon asked why he was so focused on interactive storytelling. He needed to be more abstract and use modern techniques. He's proposing to create a 3D diagram. All the boxes in the diagram are separate rooms, and the lines are corridors. He stared at the table in front of him. mentally imagining everything he just told his colleagues. Each room would have a door leading to different corridors, depending on the player's choices. Players will navigate corridors. This will be a process of choosing different paths within the map. Different rooms lead to different endings based on the player's choices. What kind of game is this? You have to create 3D models in a location, but in the end, all you have to do is keep going, keep going, keep going. It's really stressful, and will the guy even be able to handle it? The employee decided to write first. Lin Wan raised her hand and told the boss she thought it was very original. Pei Qian thought to himself that this was incredibly boring, and that's just how he wanted it to be. But if it was simply boring, he was afraid it would be impossible to disappoint the players. While the boy was thinking, an interesting thought occurred to him, and he understood everything. The boss exclaimed that he had an idea. They would add a voiceover to the game. Lin Wan was very surprised and asked about the voiceover. Pei Qian said that it would be their way of communicating with players. They will use a voiceover to communicate with them. For example, if they make an incorrect decision, track A will play, and if they make the correct decision, track B will play. There will also be a surcharge. If he listened, then selling services with a surcharge could bring in some good money, so why refuse? But now a new problem arises. Choose a large or small bonus. He personally advises choosing the large bonus. But if reputation is important, why not make the right choice from the start? He still chose money over his dream. Fine, he doesn't have to explain it. He understands that's how people are. This situation is typical in the gaming industry and nothing unexpected. Every time the player makes a decision, there will be some kind of feedback. This way, the player won't feel bored and lonely. Lin Wan didn't expect the boss to be so smart. Just think, Boss Pei Qian came up with such a brilliant idea, as expected of a genius. Pei Qian told his staff that the sketch and work plan should be ready in a week. The drawings should be ready in 2 weeks. He asked if there were any questions. Then the boy with glasses told the boss not to worry and that he would do everything. Pei Qian rose from his desk and told his staff that was all. He sent them home. The boss called his comrade Ma Yan into his office. He had already made several cups of tea. Pei Qian asked him how things were going. 3 days had already passed, and had he decided on a location? But the boy was a little upset, and, casting a contemptuous glance at him, replied that he hadn't found it yet. Suddenly, he accidentally spilled tea from his mouth right on him. The boy thought that the only one who made him happy was himself. He would have spent the entire system account if he were like him. Mayan told his boss that he felt that finding a good assistant was the priority right now. Pei Qian trusted Ma Yan, as he would easily fail. But what if his assistant turned out to be capable? Then the boy looked towards the employee and asked what kind of assistant he was looking for. Ma Yan explained that he found someone on the internet and is now trying to hire him, offering him a high salary. Pei Qian thought that there were many hidden gems on the internet, but also a lot of mediocrity. There's a good chance of finding a second partner, of course. He asked the employee if he could tell him more. Ma Yan began to explain that he thought that if they wanted to open an internet cafe, the most important part would be the computers. They didn't need to buy computers from famous brands. They needed to be unique, different from the rest. They have to assemble them themselves. The boy explained that he found a repairman on a forum. He's a renowned professional. Pei Qian immediately closed his eyes and told the employee that it was a great job and he should do it without any problem. How can you not know poetry? 3,000 will go to the forum. He'll take what he needs and run home. 3,000 will go to something else, opening an internet cafe across from the school. If they hire an expert from a forum to build computers, each computer will cost at least 30,000. The very thought of this makes him happy. Pei Qian agreed and asked them to hire him, be more polite, and offer him more money. He should work hard enough to meet his expectations. He thinks they should pay him at least 8,000 a month. Ma Yan told Brother Chiang that frankly, even he only gets 5,000 so far. Then the boss asked him if he thought he was underestimating him. He completed the task on time, so he was giving him a bonus. Ma Yan asked his boss not to worry and promised to do everything to complete the project. He smiled and told his boss he was going to work. The boy walked out the door, and Pei Qian remained sitting in the chair, lost in thought. He thought there shouldn't be any problems in the gameplay department. Ma Yan had a professional on his side. Only Huang Shibo remains. He hasn't shown up for a couple of days and is wondering if he's figured out how to spend his million. February 8th arrived. Many people were at the train station. The guy knocked on his boss's door. The employee came in and told him the game developer's sketches were ready, and he asked him to take a look. The boss was very surprised and asked if it was really that fast and whether he had worked overtime. He asked the boy to sit down so they could talk about it. The employee explained that he simply felt like he was in the flow and would be highly productive, but he wasn't working overtime. Pei-chan immediately praised the guy. He thought about how last time he hadn't read the drafts, so he'd missed a lot and the end result had been terrible. He wouldn't screw it up like that again. The employee, in turn, was very worried and hoped he wouldn't reject anything. Pei-chan asked him about several places. The guy began to explain what exactly he was planning in these places and asked to take a look. He thought about how, when Huang showed the first sketch of the ocean fortress, Boss Pei had immediately accepted it. So Huang's sketch was flawless, and the boss had nothing to worry about. So far, his boss doesn't think his sketches are very good, and he's worried she'll make a mistake. So he helps him by carefully studying the sketches. He even asks him questions. Pei-chan closed his eyes, staring at this diagram. He imagined a card game, a role-playing game, a strategy game, an action game, an RPG, a combat game, a real-time strategy game, a first-person shooter, and just a shooter. And finally the boy got to the card game and began to move on. He walked along a long corridor that was completely illuminated by bright light. In front of him were several doors, 3 kingdoms, mythology, and many others. The boy didn't stop there but kept moving forward. He had 2-dimensional maps, character templates, and a full 3-dimensional set. Here he paused and glanced at one of the entries and thought about it. He thought about how there was no interaction or action here. Just walking around and exploring. Even in his thoughts, it was boring. He liked this idea and, smiling, told the employee he could get started. He thought to himself, they'll add a voiceover that will mock the player and ruin the whole atmosphere, and wouldn't that be a failure? Pei-chan explained to his employee that everything had to be of the highest quality and that no savings could be made. The guy told his boss not to worry. He would definitely follow his instructions and continually improve his results. Meanwhile, Ma-yan went to see his boss and began telling him that he had hired a partner. He asked if he wanted to meet him, and here before us was a huge, beautiful cafe. Tables stood one after the other in a row. The fair-haired boy asked Zhang Yuan to go quickly, because the customers were asking for a song. The guy, hearing the boss, said that he would wipe his hands and come right away. The boy took the microphone in his hands and began to sing about the sparrows outside the window chirping on a perch. His name is Zhang Yuan. He is 24 years old and he works as a singer and bartender in a bar. The cafe was completely empty. No one was sitting at the tables and it was sad. Only one couple was already leaving. And even then, it was the boss who asked his employee to remember to close the door before leaving. The guy was wiping the table with a rag, looking very sad, and suddenly his phone rang. When he read the message, he was very surprised. They asked him if he had a minute to stop by Liangzhou. They offered him a job, with all accommodation and food expenses covered, and an additional 3,000 yuan for the work, and a deposit as a sign of good intentions. The guy was shocked by such an offer, and couldn't understand where this rich man had come from. Zhang Yuan, a singer and bartender master from the forum, said it was the Tengda who created the Ghost General and the Ocean Fortress. The boy stood right in front of a tall building that was so huge it seemed to reach the sky. A girl came out to him and asked if he was Mr. Zhang Yuan. The guy replied that it was him. Then the girl asked him to follow her, explaining that his boss, Pei-chan, was waiting for him. The girl took the guy into the office and told the boss that Mr. Zhang had already arrived. The boss asked him to sit down and skip the formalities. He offered him some tea. Cheng Yuan felt awkward and couldn't understand why such an influential person needed him, or he wants him to make him drinks or sing. Just don't let him say he wants him to make him drinks and sing. Pei-chan asked what the ideal computer configuration would be to handle all modern games and how much it would cost. The boy realized he'd invited him to ask him to build him a computer. He seemed interested in his reputation on the forum. He has enough money, and it is clear that he cannot deceive him, so he will do everything in the best possible way. While the boss closed his eyes, Zhang began to look closely at him, his eyebrows drawn closer to his nose. What if he took 1,000 yuan out of the 3,000 and spent it on building a computer? Maybe he could make friends with such an influential person. Cheng Yuan began explaining to his boss which processor and motherboard could be installed based on his requirements. He also suggested specific RAM and cores. The guy started telling me about the power supply, case, keyboard, mouse, and headphones. He explained that everything would cost about 15,000, but he figured it would actually cost around 16,000. And if you assemble it in Computer City, it will cost a full 20,000. Pei-chan replied that such a build would handle all modern popular games, and asked what about future games that would require more. He asked him to expand his horizons and asked how he could handle that. He increased the budget by 10,000 yuan. The boy immediately put his hand to his head and replied that they could take another processor. Everything will cost 20,000 with such components. The computer will not need updating for another 2 years. Peiqian exclaimed, looking at the boy, that this was quite good. He thought to himself that this was the maximum the system would allow him to open an internet cafe. Cheng Yuan thought it would actually cost at least 26,000. He'd have to put up another 1,000 of his own money. If he didn't befriend the boss, it would be robbery. Peiqian, drinking tea, replied that then that was fine for him and that he needed 50 computers. Cheng Yuan splashed his tea at the boss and began to sweat profusely. He hadn't expected so many computers. The guy told the boss that he felt bad about paying him 3,000 for the assembly, so he wanted to pawn 1,000 yuan of his own to make friends with him. But he needed as many as 50 computers. Peiqian replied that it wasn't worth it, and that he deserved the 3,000. He asked them not to make any concessions to him. He won't let him work for free, and in addition to these 3,000, he will add 200 yuan for each computer. Cheng Yuan asked if he was sure he should. Peiqian replied that he was planning to open an internet cafe and asked if he would be interested in moving to Jingzhou and working under favorable conditions. The boy was even more shocked, and tears began to flow from his eyes. He exclaimed that of course he wanted to. The guy thought that since his boss was rich, he was sure the bonuses would be reasonable. Could it be that his life was getting better? Then the boss asked the boy to talk about his work experience. Zhang Yuan immediately drooped and hung his head. He explained that he currently works as a singer and bartender at a bar. He also works as a forum host. As the guy told this, tears started flowing from his eyes. He thought about how his boss wanted to hire him because he was tech-savvy and computer-savvy. But his resume wasn't exactly impressive. But Peiqian asked if it was not excellent and exclaimed that he had many talents. Cheng Yuan was even more surprised. The boy explained that he could open a small bar in the internet cafe where he could make drinks. If he's also a singer, he should pay him 3 times as much. Peiqian called Shin's assistant and asked her to come over. He explained to the girl that a new contract needed to be prepared, and now she was already entering the office. Shin brought the contract to her boss and said it was ready. Peiqian immediately thanked her. He handed over the contract to Zhang Yuan and said he would manage the internet cafe while also working as a bartender and singer. In total, he would earn 14,000 rubles a month. I asked him to take a look, and if he had no questions, he could sign. The guy thought there were no questions at all. There are no hidden costs. Even the salary is written in black and white. After all, he comes from a poor family. Cheng Yuan fell to his knees and exclaimed, looking up to the sky, that he was becoming successful. 2 minutes later, someone knocked on the boss's door and the boy asked to come in. It was Ma Yan. He greeted his brother and said that it was he leaning out of the doorway. The boy led his employees into his office, and Ma Yan asked him how everything had worked out. The guy asked if he was trustworthy. Zhang Yuan grabbed his head and, smiling, asked him not to flatter him. Peiqian put his arm around the boy's shoulders and exclaimed that it was just a great job and he had done well. Cheng Yuan thought that this long-faced guy with an idiotic expression was an unusual person. Ma Yan told his boss that he had decided on a location and showed it on his tablet. He explained that he went to see it in person. The location was great and the building was new. It used to be a restaurant, but it closed due to mismanagement. The space was about 3,000 square meters, and the rent was 315,000 rubles a month. Ma Yan exclaimed that it seemed cheap to him and asked how his boss felt about it. Ma Yan was shocked and wondered why they didn't take into account the fact that the restaurant there had closed. It's a business district with a shopping center across the street. Business districts are car-free. He wondered where he could find clients. He thought the rent was cheap, but the location was truly terrible. Should he voice his opinion? But he's just a newbie. Ma Yan asked Brother Qian to take a look. The boss said it wasn't bad. He clapped his hands and exclaimed that it was a good place, and they had to choose it. Ma Yan showed off his skills and exclaimed that he knew he would be pleased. His partner was even more surprised. He thought that he would only get into trouble now, since boss Peiqian had given everything the green light. Peiqian decided to quickly voice the plan, and then they could begin. The internet cafe wouldn't be the only thing the store would have, so they only needed 50 computers. Ma Yan agreed. Then the boss quoted 10 yuan an hour. They'll also set up a bar and organize everything according to standards. Does Zhang Yuan know how to make drinks? He can prepare drinks for customers whenever he's free. Make sure the bar has enough space to accommodate customers, and play some light music. Zhang Yuan sings, so feel free to sing a song or two if he's in the mood. Besides, this place used to be a restaurant. They'll hire a chef to cook homemade food. Things like fried tomatoes, scrambled eggs, pork, fried cabbage, and more. They'll set up a store on the second floor and sell accessories or spare parts. As long as it breaks even, the prices won't matter. We need to build a small private cinema. A couple of seats will be enough. Peikin said that this was very good and that something from this should work. Yang Ma thought that Brother Qian was magnificent and that he expected nothing less from him. The boss asked how it all worked out, and as they say, small but mighty. He thought it was simply perfect. Zhang Yuan couldn't figure out what he was doing and decided it was some kind of hodgepodge. If you did something like that, wouldn't customers just come in to surf the internet and eat or drink coffee? And how many people could afford 10 yuan an hour? Pei Qian said that was quite good, and they could do something else later. Zhang Yuan thought that when a customer picks up a menu, on one side, there will be a list of expensive wines. And on the other side, there will be fried tomatoes and scrambled eggs. The guy couldn't understand how he could stand it. He wanted to tell his boss something. But Pei Qian stopped him and said that the Tengda store was the first step to opening a physical store. He asked the boy not to dwell on his initial losses. They continued their conversation. The boss abruptly rose from the sofa and walked over to the window. He began explaining that this was an entertainment zone, combining entertainment, life, games, and many other things. It's normal not to be able to apply this immediately. People's perceptions need to be gradually changed. Zhang Yuan continued listening to the boss and thinking about this. He bowed his head. If Boss Pei says there's no need to worry about the first losses, then it probably won't happen. Yanma told his boss he'd start working then. The boss immediately agreed. Zhang Yuan thought he could earn more than 10,000 a month, and there was no need to doubt it. Meanwhile, the company employee sat at his computer, completing his task. Peikin was also sitting at the computer and thinking about his plan. He decided that everything was settled with Lu Ming and Mayano. Only his employee, Huang Shibo, remained. He hasn't shown up for work in a while. We need to find out more about his progress. Peikin logged onto his computer and began checking the information. Wang had written that he had decided to pursue a career in film. He'd always dreamed of it, but it was difficult, so he'd chosen the gaming industry. But now he had a chance, and he decided to follow his dream. Pei Tian immediately considered the film industry. He exclaimed, "Who is this? It's just great. It's easy to lose money in this field." He was very happy because he still needed to ask about this, and this was very good. The boy started dialing someone on the phone. He dialed his coworker. He asked him if he had enough money. He said he could give him more. But Huang Shibo replied that it wasn't necessary. He'd already given him $1 million, so how could he ask for more? Peikin asked him not to worry and asked where he was now. If the script and director were ready, could he come? And here in front of us rises a huge multi-story building that seems to reach to the very heavens. Huang Shibo looked at the high-rise and called his boss. He explained to the boy that he had already arrived. He is with him right now at the company, and answered his boss that in this case, they will meet later. Huang Shibo was very happy with what was happening to him now, and that he had the opportunity to move up in terms of earnings. He asked his friend to go with him and explained that Pei's boss was waiting for them in the office. Huang Shibo didn't have time to open the door and called his boss. He explained that he was the director he had hired. He is a fourth-year student at Hagdong University majoring in film directing, and his name is Zhu Xiaoche. The guy greeted his boss and shook his hand. Pei Qian was glad he was a fourth-year student majoring in directing, since he couldn't create anything. He asked the boy to sit down, and he immediately agreed. Pei Qian asked him what he wanted to film, but before the guy could answer, the boss asked if $1 million was enough. Ma Yin asked his friend not to worry, and said that they wanted to make a small work, and it was a short film. The equipment and post-production costs are minimal, so it won't cost much. Pei Qian asked what short film they were talking about and had a bad feeling about it. He only asked the guys not to say that the film was called Surprise. Then the guys looked at each other, not understanding what he was talking about. The boss raised his hand and said nothing. He asked if they had thought about what they wanted to make the film about and whether they already had a script. Zhu Xiaozu adjusted his glasses and addressed his boss. He explained that they wanted to fire him. Then the boy was very surprised and asked what they meant. Huang Xibo replied that it was partly his wish. Zhu Xiaoche added that he had heard his story from Huang, so they wanted to film some events from his life. Pei Qian wondered if these were events from his work. He thought to himself that the number of times he had been to the company could be counted on the fingers of one hand. The very thought of it is boring. If it's boring, it won't be popular. If it's not popular, it will be impossible to advertise, and the likelihood of losing money is high. Huang Shibo mentioned that they would write the script this week and then come to start filming. Zhu Xiaozi added that they would do just that, and that they would film it in the style of a short film. He would just have to follow the script. Then the boss asked if they could spend $1 million on filming. He thought to himself that if they wanted to film his life, everything they needed was already in the office. Perhaps they were just trying to avoid spending money on locations and costumes. Chu Xiaozu asked his boss not to worry, and said he and Huang had discussed it. They would pay him and the other employees for their time. Even though he has plenty of money, this could be considered a small gesture from them. The boss was very surprised by this offer. Huang Xibo added that they would also cover the rental costs, purchase equipment, and handle post-processing and everything else. And the remaining money will be spent on advertising. Pei Qin was even more surprised when they mentioned rent. Chu Xiaozu explained that they wanted to film 30 episodes, each about a minute long. And they would be paid 1,000 rubles per episode, as the main characters, while the others would get 200 per episode.